History of the Labor Movement in the United States, Volume 6, On the Eve of America's Entrance into World War I, 1915-1916, by Philip S. Foner. INTERN at I0 na LPU BLISHERS, New York. Errata. Contents. Preface 1. Henry Ford's $5 8-hour day. Why the $5 8-hour day? 5. Speed up. King, 7. Ford Sociological Department, 9. How? Representative was Henry Ford? 11. 352. An unusual strike in the Arizona copper mines, 13. Grievances of Mexican-American copper miners, 13. The miners organize, 15. The miners strike, 16. The companies respond, 16. Company managers appeal to Governor Hunt, 17. Governor Hunt's unusual response, 18. Strike settled, 21. After the strike, 2-3. 3. A steel strike, a riot, and an unusual sequel, 25. East Youngstown arson, 26. Developments in steel, 26. Conditions in East Youngstown, 29. The Saint_Reich and the riot, 3-2. Explanations for the riot, 34. Strike results, 3-7. The sequel, 37. 4. The Standard Oil strikes in Bayonne, New Jersey, 1915-1916. Gutman's status conflict thesis, 41. How Standard Oil of New Jersey controlled Bayonne, 42. Background for the 41. 8. Contents L915 strike, 45. Background for anti-labor violence, 47. Standard Oil resorts to violence to break strike, 48. Anti-strike propaganda, 51. Standard Oil refuses arbitration, 5-2. Strike-breaking role of Sheriff Kinkhead, 53. The strike is broken, 54. Some concessions to workers, 55. A new walkout, 56. Split in the ranks of Standard Oil workers, 56. Standard Oil rejects strikers' demands, 57. Police mob. Violence in Bayonne, 58. What shall be done with these murderers, 60. 1916 strike is broken, 61. Anti-immigrant bias, 61. John Reed on the Bayonne strikers, 62. 5. The New York City transit strike of 1916. The first phase. Previous struggles of transit workers, 65. Rampant anti-unionism, 67. Working conditions of transit labor, 68. Management autocracy, 69. Strike begins in Westchester, 70. Strike spreads to Bronx, 72. Strike spreads still further, 73. Police protection for strikebreakers, 76. Company propaganda, 77. Role of Socialist New York call, 78. Truce settlement, 80. 6. The New York Transit strike of 1916. The second phase. The truce in practice, 84. The second transit strike begins, 88. PSC reports, 90. Preparations for a general strike, 92. The general strike fiasco, 96. Why the general strike failed, 98. End of the transit strike, 100. Aftermath, 100. 7. New unionism in the garment industry. Upheaval in the garment unions, 103. Women of the Amalgamated, 107. Struggles of the Amalgamated, L08. A. Progressive Women's Program, 112. Women of the ILGWU, 114. N. Y. Cloakmakers Strike of 1916, 117. The Fur Workers Forge Ahead, 118. On Words and Deeds, 120. Unions and Gangsters, 121. Contents 8. The Women's Trade Union League on the Eve of World War I. A Gloomy Picture, 124. Gomper's Explanation, 125. The League, the IWW, and the AFL, 125. Emergence of the Woman Organizer, 131. The Minimum Wage, 133. The League and Woman Suffrage, 135. Strained Relations between League and AFL, 140. 9. AN 8-hour day for the railroad. Brotherhoods, 9 months of fruitless negotiations. The Erdman Act, 143. The Newlands Act, 145. Negotiations begin. The War of Words, 150. The press joins the War of Words, 15-4. The negotiations, 15-5. Failure of mediation, 157. The war of words continues, 159. The AFL and the Brotherhood's dispute, 161. 10. AN 8-hour day for the railroad. Brotherhoods, 2. The Adamson ACT. Background to the White House Conference, 164. The White House Conference, 167. Failure of the White House Conference, 172. Wilson's proposal to Congress, 176. The Adamson Act, 179. Implications of the Adamson Act, 183. Railroads fight the Adamson Act, 184. 11. Women workers on the eve of America's entrance into World War I. Economic crisis, 189. The unemployed, 190. World War I brings economic recovery, 192. Women munitions workers, 193. Strikes for the 8-hour day, Bridgeport, 194. Strikes for the 8-hour day, Pittsburgh, 196. Battling the high cost of living, 199. Developments in Seattle, 201. For a national 8-hour day, 204. X 123,143,164,189. X. Contents 12. Black workers on the eve of America's entrance into World War I 206. Status of black labor in 1914, 206. Decline of the black artisan in the South, 210. Exclusion of blacks from northern industry, 213. Impact of racism, 215. Causes of the Great Migration, 216. Recruiting of Southern blacks for northern industry, 218. Emergence of black industrial working class, 220. 13. Election of 1916. Relations between AFL and Wilson administration, 222. AFL supports Wilson for re-election, 223. Democratic Party platform, 224. Wilson's acceptance speech, $22. Hughes makes Adamson Act an issue, 226. Organized labor intensifies support for Wilson, 228. Wilson narrowly re-elected, 229. Reference notes. Index 222,232,246. History of the Labor Movement in the United States, Volume 6. Preface. In the 5th volume of my multi-volume History of the Labor Movement in the United States, the AFL in the Progressive Era, 1910 to 191, I trace the story of American labor's economic and political activities in one of the most crucial eras in its development. The present volume brings the story to the eve of America's entrance into World War I. In the next, or 7th, volume, I will carry the story to the declaration of war by the United States against Germany and the other Central Powers in April 1917. In the process I will trace the position of the labor and socialist movements toward U.S. imperialism from the turn of the 20th century and toward the events between the outbreak of World War I in August 1914 and America's entrance almost 3 years later. The present volume covers a shorter time span than the previous ones. This has been necessary because most of the movements and labor struggles discussed here have been totally ignored or casually treated in the 4th volume of the Commons Wisconsin History of Labor. The United States, 1896 to 1932, by Selig Perlman and Philip Taft. As in the previous volumes, the focus in the present work is on organized movements and resistance, on workers who belonged or sought to belong to trade unions, and on those who, as in the case of blacks and women, had to wage a persistent and often futile struggle to convince the racist, sexist, and craft-oriented labor leaders that there was a place in the American labor movement for all workers, regardless of skill, race, color, sex, or national origin. A number of American scholars still cling to the view that unless a work on American labor emphasizes exclusively the new trend in labor historiography associated with the approach of E.P. Thompson in England and Herbert Gutman and David Montgomery in the United States, it is merely a continuation of the Commons Wisconsin School. A work, in their opinion, to merit the label of labor history, must focus on community, family, social relations, and cultural traditions. Should it deal with the development of working-class institutions and conflicts? 4. Preface mainly trade unions and strikes, as does the present volume, it is dismissed as traditional labor history. All who are interested in the history of the American working class must welcome the valuable information and insights of recent community and industrial studies of the American working class associated with the new labor history while, at the same time, regretting the absence of any integrated analysis by the separate studies. But to assume that this is the only significant aspect of our working class history and that any effort to deal with the development of working class institutions and struggles, through trade unions, strikes, and political action, is no longer relevant smacks both of ignorance and elitism. In moving beyond what they call the traditional confines of labor history, not a few of the new labor historians have left the working class without any outlets through which they can voice their discontent and change their conditions. As in the case of the previous volumes, this work could not have been completed without the generous assistance of numerous libraries and historical societies. I am again indebted to the American Federation of Labor, particularly the late Florence Thorne, for permission to use the incoming correspondence of the Federation and the letter books of Samuel Gompers. I wish again to thank Dorothy Swanson and her staff at the Tamiment Institute, Elmer Bobst Library, New York University, for kind assistance and cooperation, and the staffs of the Chicago Historical Society, Library of Congress, National Archives, State Historical Society of Wisconsin, Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union, Arthur and Elizabeth Schlesinger Library on the History of Women in America, Radcliffe College, Library of the U.S. Department of Labor, New York State Library, New York Public Library, Free Library of Philadelphia, Bayonne Municipal Library, Bayonne, New Jersey, Youngstown Public Library, Youngstown, Ohio, and the libraries of Columbia University, University of Arizona, University of Pennsylvania, University of Nebraska, University of Pittsburgh, Rutgers University, University of Maryland, Georgetown University, University of Washington, Brown University, Catholic University of America, University of Florida, University of Chicago, and University of Rochester. I also wish to thank the members of the library staff of the Langston Hughes Memorial Library, Lincoln University, Pennsylvania for cooperation and assistance in obtaining materials through interlibrary loan from libraries, historical societies, and other institutions. PHILIPS. Foner. Chapter 1. Henry Ford's $5, 8-hour day. In the age of industrial violence, which preceded America's entrance into World War I, during which years labor had to battle endlessly and militantly for every gain in shorter hours, higher wages, and better working conditions, Henry Ford inaugurated a grand experiment in welfare capitalism. On January 5, 1914, he instituted a $5 daily wage and the 8-hour day. Why the $5 8-hour day? Scholars have long debated over what factors were responsible for these unprecedented industrial innovations, whether humanitarian or fiscal considerations predominated. We need not concern ourselves over deciding whether Ford was self-serving and hypocritical or self-serving and honestly interested in progressive reform. It is likely that both elements were present. What we should note is that certain basic factors compelled Henry Ford's voluntary establishment of the $5 8-hour day. It is certainly no accident that the voluntary adoption of these two major policies occurred shortly after Ford instituted a moving belt assembly line. The new methods and techniques of production, developed from 1910 to 1914, drastically altered the skills necessary for factory operations. Consequently, with the expansion in plant facilities to meet the growing demand for the Model T Ford, thousands of unskilled Southern and Eastern European immigrants swarmed into the Highland Park factory. By 1914, Stephen Meyer points out, the Ford Motor Company employed 12,880 workers, and the overwhelming majority, 9,109, were foreign-born. The 5 largest nationality. 6. On the eve of America's entrance into World War I, groups Poles, Russians, Romanians, Italians and Sicilians, and Austro-Hungarians constituted a majority of the workforce and came from the least industrialized area of Europe. 2. The second factor to bear in mind is that Ford's Highland Park plant experienced tremendous problems which interfered with establishing a stable force between 1910 and 1913. In 1913, Ford hired over 52,000 men to maintain a complement of 14,000 workers. 6 times as many employees quit as were fired. Absenteeism ran as high as 10% daily. 3. Ford himself offered several explanations for the labor liberalization of 1914. His most direct linking of such policies with the labor crisis confronting the company occurred in a statement recalled by Joseph Galam, an official in the experimental toolroom. Mr. Ford, Galam reported, said he would lick the IWW by paying the men the $5 day. For the 8-hour day was even more pointedly designed to disarm the industrial workers of the world IWW, which had led a brief, unsuccessful strike of 5,000 Studebaker workers seeking 8 hours and had won the shorter day at 3 Detroit metal wheel factories during the previous year. Although Melvin Dubofsky minimizes the wobbly role in Detroit in his history of the IWW, and although Alan Nevin's critical biography of Ford finds the connection between fear of the IWW and the 1914 policies, not supported by real evidence, there can be little doubt that the IWW, or more exactly, the employer's fear of the IWW, helped to shape Ford's labor policy. 5 The Wobblies propagandized why at Ford's factory gates, demanding 8 hours and causing Ford officials to revoke the employees' privilege of eating outside plant gates in order to insulate them from IWW agitators who were rumored to be readying a strike at Ford. While the IWW had probably not organized more than 1/30 of Detroit's 60,000 auto workers, it had shown, at Studebaker, a capacity for influencing those who were not members. 6 Moreover, IWW doctrines of sabotage and slowdown spread fear among Alto factory owners and the industrially organized AFL Carriage, Wagon and Automobile Workers Union as well as AFL craft unions were organizing the plants with some success. The employers, who favored Detroit as the location for the auto industry in large part because of its status as an open-shop town, could, as one scholar has recently put it, not assume that their antagonists were as weak as they proved to be. For that reason, Ford's "Lit the IWW" stance embodied also in his statement to a Detroit periodical that there will be no more excitement in Detroit's labor circles, following his 1914 innovations, deserves to be considered a serious motivation for his actions. 7. In a second and more general explanation of his rationale for instituting the 8-hour day, Ford declared, "We have settled on the 8-hour day, not because 8 hours is 1/3 of a day but because it so happens that this is the length of time which we find gives the best service from men, day in and day out." 8 One can argue that there was no solid evidence on which to base such a conclusion, but there certainly is no doubt that in inaugurating 3 shifts, with only one 10-minute lunch break on each shift, Ford secured optimum use from his machinery. As a part of low-cost production, he noted, one must have big investment machinery and power plants. Expensive tools cannot remain idle. They ought to work 24 hours a day. 9. Ford and his advisors also believed that efficiency would be served by the 8-hour, $5 day in that the new labor policy decreased turnover and absenteeism and increased labor discipline. The distance of the Highland Park plant, an early suburban factory, from working-class urban enclaves, helps to account in part for the high turnover and absences. Reducing the length of the working day could partially compensate for this long commute. More fundamentally, the high absenteeism reflected alienation engendered by a rapid rationalization of production. In 1903, at the Mac, a venue factory, according to Ford, workmen fetched parts and material to one central location and built a car, exactly the same way one builds a house. By 1907, at the Piquet plant, 45 cars sat in a circle and specialized workers, or work groups, walked from one to the next performing a limited task. That same year, time and motion studies began at Ford and foremen received orders to enforce standards of production based on calculations of engineers armed with stopwatches. If the first man does not come up to that standard, production supervisor Max Wallering wrote, "Try another." That was Henry's scheme of things. 11. Speed up King. The tendency toward rationalizing labor and toward calculating production by the minute and second accelerated with the building of the Highland Park plant in 1910. Henry Ford mechanized material delivery systems in the foundry INL 912, and began to produce flywheel magnetos on a moving assembly line in April, 1913. The magneto assembly, formerly done in about 20 minutes by a single skilled mechanic working at a bench, broke down into 2 separate tasks performed by 2 men at the chain-driven pace of 13 minutes 10 seconds per person per assembly. Within a year, the line had just 14 workers, producing a magneto in just 5 minutes per person. Efficiency experts juggled the line's speed to give every second necessary but not a single unnecessary second to the assemblers. 12 In the fall of 1913, Ford men also pondered how to put assembly functions on a moving line. They knew, in September of that year, that stationary assembly required 12 hours 28 minutes of labor time under ideal conditions. Within 6 months, that standard was cut to 1 hour and 33 minutes on a moving line. Such dramatic productive advances, calculated to the second, undoubtedly predisposed Ford to reduce hours voluntarily from 10 to 9 in 1912 and then to 8 in 1914.13. Ford engineers completely revolutionized automobile making, but their changes also produced serious social consequences. Technology eliminated the multiskilled, relatively autonomous craftsman and replaced him with a skilled specialist who performed only one task all day long. In the absence of material incentives of wages and hours, the rationalization of production necessarily brought with it astronomical turnover rates. Immigrant workers referred to the Highland Park plant as the home of corrections in 1913, and the IWW branded Ford the speed-up king. 14 Upton Sinclair, whose The Flivver King is a keen analysis of the manufacture of automobiles at Ford, traced the career of Ford worker Abner Schutt. Sinclair observed that 1914 was a far cry from the days when Abner Schutt had traveled to the shed and rolled in 2 wheels by hand, and sorted out the right spindle nuts from lofts and screwed them himself. Now he oversaw a group of men whose every motion had been calculated by engineers. The completed wheels, products of an assembly line of their own, came on rows of hooks, and descended to exactly that right height to be lifted off and slid onto the axle. The man who did this did nothing else. Another man put on the spindle nuts and started them by hand. Still another finished the job with a wrench. 15. Liberal policies could ensure a workforce willing to put up with a speeded-up assembly line and disciplined labor. As Stephen Meyer observes, the $5 DI was an ingenious profit-sharing scheme to induce Ford workers to alter their attitudes and habits to meet the rigorous requirements of mass production. Under the Ford profit sharing plan, the company divided an unskilled worker's income into 2 approximately equal parts: his wages and his profits. Each worker received his wages for work done in the factory, but he received his profits, and hence, the $5 day, only when he met specific standards of productive efficiency and specific standards and conditions of domestic life. The work standard for a particular job and the pace of the assembly line determined the standard of efficiency. 16. In his book, which is an expansion of this article, Meyer notes that when the Ford Motor Company introduced its $5 profit-sharing plan in 1914, it became the most famous labor management reform in the annals of American business. Stephen Meyer 3, The $5 Day. Labor Ma 1 Engagement and Social Control in the Ford Motor Company, 1908 to 1921, Albany, New York, 1981, page 108. Actually, failure to keep up with the work standard meant loss of a job and not only loss of the profits in the wages. During the first week of the application of the 1914 reform, 1,000 workers, mostly Greeks and Serbs, were fired for taking off on a Greek Orthodox religious holiday. Working at Ford was to be a privilege. Conditions of wages and hours, however beneficent, were a matter for management, a gift and not a right. Dissident employees knew, as the engineers Horace Arnold and Fay Foroday put it in their 1914 study, that the door to the street is open for any who objects in any way. 2. Unquestioning obedience to any directions whatever. 17. Such division of labor also entailed a division between mental and physical work, or, more precisely, an abandonment of mental work to management. Ford, although he sometimes held that the average worker, above all, wants a job in which he does not have to think, saw repetitive and purely physical work as terrifying, and tried to compensate for it by encouraging an intellectual life for workers but only outside the shop. Man needs leisure to think, he wrote, and the world needs thinkers, as he experimented with a variety of night and technical schools. 18. Ford's Sociological Department. The 1914 reforms, as Ford's educational activities suggest, not only compensated for alienated labor, but also sought to develop through leisure a more efficient workforce. Italian communist philosopher Antonio Gramsci, whose commentary on America and Fordism is still an indispensable source on Ford, defined Ford's goal as the creation of a new type of worker and of man, thoroughly Americanized by night classes and utterly committed to morality and family. A worker, as justificarian for these dismissals, which amounted to 6% of the Ford workforce, a Ford official declared that, if these men are to make their home in America they should observe American holidays. Stephen Meyer, adapting the immigrant to the line, Americanization in the Ford Factory, 1914-1921, Journal of Social History 14, 19801. 74. Moreover, who would never need to join a trade union. 19. This effort constituted another rationale on Ford's part for the shorter day and higher wages. Leisure, Ford insisted, would be used by the worker for the greater happiness of his family, and this orientation toward family, whether voluntary or enforced by the 100 investigators of Ford's sociological department, was to ensure proper living among employees. The $5 wage was designed as a family wage, which would function by not only supplying the worker's basic need, but also in giving him a margin of comfort and enabling him to give his boys and girls their opportunity and his wife some pleasure in life. 2 degrees Ford refused to hire married women whose husbands had jobs and discouraged the taking in of boarders. Profit sharing, a large part of the $5 wage, did not extend to young males without dependents, family men living alone, or men in the process of divorcing. Functionaries in the sociological department, formed immediately after the labor reforms to see that money and time were wisely spent, checked to see whether men were living unworthily, by drinking excessively, smoking tobacco or defaulting on family obligations. 21 The result, according to Ford, should be that a man has more leisure to spend with his family. The family life is healthier. Workmen go out of doors, go on picnics, have time to see their children and play with them. For Ford, increased leisure was impossible without supervision, prohibition and a buttressing of family life. With these, it could be a part of the process, to use Ford's mechanical metaphor, of repairing men like boilers, or, to use Gramsci's language, to maintain the continuity of physical and muscular nervous energy of the worker. 22. Efficiency, then, meant both the creation of a stable, disciplined labor force on the job and the reproduction of that workforce through family life. Public and private fiscal and humanitarian considerations were inseparable. Indeed, John B. Lee, Ford personnel manager and first head of the sociological department, recalled that it was not until 1912 that management began to realize something of the relative value of men, and that it did so after an investigation into declining production in a drop hammer operation revealed that sickness, indebtedness, and fear and worry over things entirely related to the home had crept in and put a satisfactory human unit entirely out of harmony with the things necessary for production. The company's first response in that case, cutting hours from 10 to 9 and raising wages 15% and interpreting the problem as one of family life, set the precedence for 1914.23. Although it is difficult to judge how much family life, temperance, and education were really beneficed by Ford's labor reforms, productive efficiency was served. Labor turnover dropped by 90% and absenteeism was at least halved and, according to some figures, plummeted from 10% to 0.3% per day. During the first week of the 1914 reforms, 14,000 job seekers descended on the Highland Park factory in search of now desirable employment. In departments where no technological or operations changes occurred, 8-hour productivity easily exceeded that formerly accomplished in 9. Ford could report that the $5 8-hour day was one of the finest cost-cutting moves ever made. 24. It is significant that Ford was achieving success with his system of scientific management, precisely when the theories of Frederick W. Taylor, the father of scientific management, were having less impact. According to Daniel Nelson's definitive work, Frederick W. Taylor and the Rise of Scientific Management, Taylor's time and motion studies, and piecework, wage and bonus systems, met with only limited success at the time Ford was achieving great results. Labor rebelled against the speed-up, and management wanted to avoid trouble. While Taylor was a genius with machines, he lacked any understanding of how to appeal to working people. 25 Ford's $5 8-hour day did appeal. How representative was Henry Ford? Despite its obvious advantages profit-wise, Ford's labor reforms did not spark a broad imitative trend among American industrialists on the eve of the U.S. entrance into World War I. Even in Detroit, where other automakers faced problems like Ford's, the 1914 reforms met with opposition rather than enthusiasm. As the Socialist Party of Michigan expressed its appreciation in a pamphlet, some among Ford's fellow automakers branded him a traitor to his class. Hugh Chalmers, a leading auto entrepreneur, called Ford's step radical, and chided him for not consulting industry leaders. Only one auto-related company, Timken Axle in Akron, followed the Ford formula of shorter hours and higher wages. 26. General business reaction was also negative. The Wall Street Journal criticized the new policies as an economic crime and an intrusion of biblical principles where they do not belong. The New York Times, then, as now, an excellent barometer of corporate opinion, branded Ford's actions as distinctly utopian and against all experience, and sent a reporter to ask Ford if he were a socialist. Pittsburgh's Industrial World saw the action as part of Ford's madness for publicity, and the Detroit press predicted that it would spark an epidemic of strikes. 27. Actually, an epidemic of strikes did occur in the years immediately following the introduction of Henry Ford's $5, 8-hour day. By 1916, the country was gripped by the largest strike wave it had yet experienced. Many were for higher wages as workers sought to catch up with the rising cost of living, and more than 600 strikes for the 8th-hour day began on May 1, 1916. Whatever the cause, the number of strikes in 1916 doubled over that of the previous year, which itself was a year marked by many strikes. Not only were these strikes of unprecedented size, but a sharp upsurge of interest in workers' control was manifested in these struggles. Underlying this development was a collection of grievances affecting both the skilled and unskilled. The introduction of a series of managerial rationalizations, including incentive pay programs, the institution of engineering departments, specialized machinery, new methods of cost accounting, time clocks and assembly lines, in short, what was commonly referred to as Taylorism, undermined the traditional control over production that skilled workers had held by virtue of their knowledge and expertise. Among the largely immigrant unskilled workers, speed-ups, unemployment, long hours, and low wages drew militant protest. As David Montgomery put it, the new industrial discipline had promoted a sense of raw injustice among, as well as within, the ethnic communities. 28. According to Upton Sinclair, praise for Ford came mainly from labor and the social uplifters. The Flivver King, New York, 1928, page 123. However, John R. Commons, the progressive labor historian, called Ford's labor program just old-fashioned industrial autocracy tempered by faith in human nature. Henry Ford, Miracle Maker, Independent 102, May, 1920, 161. In 1934, Mike Gold, communist writer, recalled that many progressives believed at one time that Henry Ford's program of high wages and shorter hours, combined with RHC's most ingenious technique of mass production, would abolish poverty and unemployment forever. IR was all a great myth, Gold noted, and IR blew up with a great bang and a nauseating smell during the Depression. The Ford Hunger March of March 7, 1932, or the Ford Hunger Massacre, as it came to be known after 4 of the unemployed marchers were killed and 24 wounded by Dearborn police and Ford's servicemen, ended all this liberal talk about Henry's benevolence forever. Henry Ford's Inferno, in THT Mike Gold Reader, New York, 1934, pp. 91-92. For a discussion of the Ford Hunger Massacre, see Alex Baskin, The Ford Hunger March 1932, A Boer History 13, Summer, 1972, 331-60, and Maurice Sugar, The Ford Hunger March, Berkeley, Cal, 1980. Chapter 2. An unusual strike in the Arizona copper mines. On January 22, 1916, the New Republic issued an appeal for support of 5,000 copper miners on strike in Arizona. In its appeal, the Liberal Weekly noted, an entire mining community in eastern Arizona has been on strike for nearly 4 months. Rather than submit to the terms of employment imposed by 3 large mining corporations, 5,000 copper miners, their wives and children, are enduring deprivation and hunger. A special reason supporting the plea for aid was also noted. Though the people are in dire need, many of them actually starving, and though more than 2/3 are Mexicans, there has been no disorder. Not a single arrest has been made for violence. The mining towns of Greenlee County have never been more peaceful. 1. Although the Outlook did not share the New Republic's viewpoint on most issues, it did endorse the appeal. The Journal noted in amazement that, for more than 19 weeks a strike of copper miners has taken place in Arizona but virtually without violence. 2. Grievances of Mexican-American copper miners. In our previous volume, we described the long, bitter, and, in the end, defeated strike led by the Western Federation of Miners in 1913 in the northern Michigan copper mines operated by the giant Calumet and Hecla Corporation. But 2 years later there was another strike in the towns of Clifton, Morenci, and Metcalf of eastern Arizona, in the copper mines operated by the Arizona Copper Company, the Shannon, Sue Philip S. Foner, History of the Labor Movement T.F. in the UN. Ted States, Volume, New York, 1980, pp. 196-213. Copper Company and the Detroit Copper Company. The 3 companies employed about 5,000 miners, over 2/3 of whom were Mexicans. Of the 3, the most important was the Detroit Copper Company, owned by the giant Phelps Dodge & Company, a leading Wall Street corporation. 3. Regardless of whether they were Mexican nationals who had recently arrived in the Arizona mining camps or Mexicans who had resided in the area a considerable number of years, the Mexican miners were paid the same Mexican wage, assigned menial tasks with little promise of upward mobility, and treated in a distinct manner in comparison with their Anglo counterparts. For a double standard of wages prevailed throughout the Southwest mining districts, a higher wage for Anglos and a lower wage for Mexicans, even though both did precisely the same work. 5 Moreover, Mexicans were paid by a system of half pay, half goods, under which a greater part of their wages went for goods at the company's store. This resulted in a profit of 100 to 300% for the mine operators. 5 U-Mill 1915. The West Rem Federation of Miners did little to change this situation. On the contrary, the Federation contented itself with referring to Mexicans as either cheap labor and thus a constant threat to union wage standards, or as natural strikebreakers. In either case, they were not suitable for membership in the Western Federation of Miners, WFM. Hence the WFM concentrated on unionizing the American Anglo workers employed in the copper mines. However, so long as the Mexicans were excluded from the union, little real progress could be made. Themine operators simply recruited Mexicans to replace U.S. miners who were sympathetic to the Federation. At the same time, the operators extolled the Mexican worker as being obedient and cheap. His strongest point is his willingness to work for low wages. To be sure, he was also described as being childlike, unambitious, listless, physically weak, irregular and indolent. But when the Mexican workers sought to change their conditions and presented grievances to the mine operators, they were discharged and banished from the district. In justification, the Engineering and Mining Journal argued that Mexicans possessed primitive instincts and were dangerous when aroused. 6. In 1915, George Powell, an organizer for the Western Federation of Miners, broke with the traditional pattern of the Union toward Mexican miners and launched an organizing drive in the copper mines of eastern Arizona, where for years the Mexican miners had been working for a lower wage than was being paid in the other mining sections of the state. Powell pointed out that, in Miami, one of the nearest camps to Clifton, Morenci, and Metcalf, where the Mexican workers are in the majority, the American miners have a minimum of $3.50 a day underground when copper is selling at 13 cents or less. But in Clifton, Metcalf, and Morenci, the men are working for as low a scale as $1.62 a day, even though copper is selling at 18 cents. But wages was only one of the grievances of the Mexican miners. Powell explained. Others were the selling of jobs to the Mexican miners, the refusal on the part of the managers to meet committees or to listen to any grievances, raffling off worthless or nearly worthless articles by petty or underbosses, the workers in many cases being compelled to buy chances. 7. This was not an exaggeration. In the other Arizona copper camps, the miners belonged to the Western Federation of Miners, and elected grievance committees which negotiated regularly with the mining companies. In Clifton, Metcalf, and Morenci, they were unorganized, there was no machinery for discussing grievances, and the companies had made it clear for years that they did not consider unions suitable to the needs of Mexicans. For years these workers had been forced to endure the dishonesty and brutality of petty foremen who had sold jobs, forced raffles on them, and in other ways taken advantage of the fact that they were unorganized Mexican Americans. While the mining companies obeyed the state's 8-hour law, they paid the men for only 7 hours and a half, deducting the time required to pass from the collar of the shaft to the working place and back again at the end of the shift. There was also an uncertain leasing system, under which written leases for company houses were either not given, or when given might be cancelled, or rents raised, as soon as miners began to earn more wages. 8. The miners organize. In the summer of 1915, George Powell arrived in Greenlee County to organize the unorganized Mexican Americans and the small number of white Americans into the Western Federation of Miners. He pointed out that since the outbreak of war in Europe in the summer of 1914, there had been a greater demand for copper and that prices were escalating. So too were prices, but wages were stationary, and the miners, he emphasized, received little of the huge profits the companies were reaping from war orders. 9. The miners responded eagerly by organizing 3 locals of the Western Federation of Miners, one in each of the mining towns of Clifton, Metcalf, and Morenci. Once organized, the locals served notice on the managers of the 3 copper companies that they wished to have their committees meet with them to discuss the miners' grievances. The managers of the Arizona Copper Company and the Shannon Copper Company were out of town. The manager of the Detroit Copper Company told the union committee that his company would deal with its employees directly, and that he must decline to meet a Western Federation of Miners committee. When the other managers returned, they issued similar statements. A journalist who interviewed the managers later reported that they told him frankly, the men must not be allowed to feel that their organized effort had won them any advantage. One of the companies, Phelps Dodge and Company, operates vast, larger properties elsewhere, and it was important that the tactics of its Clifton employees be discredited lest they be adopted at other mines. 10. The miners' strike. On September 11, 1915, following the refusal of the three companies to meet in conference with representatives of the miners, 5,000 workers went on strike. To the company's astonishment, although the American miners were earning more than the Mexican Americans and were reported to be satisfied with their higher wages, they joined in the strike in sympathy with the Mexicans. 2. A few days later formal demands were made upon the companies. These included a sliding scale of wages equal to those being paid in other parts of the state, abolition of the raffle system and other petty tyrannies of the foreman, written leases with firm rents for company houses, and recognition of the Western Federation of Miners as the strikers' bargaining agent. 12. The companies respond. The companies did not even bother to reply to the demands, confining themselves to charging that the strike was solely the result of outside agitators. Ironically, Walter Douglas, general manager of Phelps Dodge and Company, raised the outside agitator charge from New York City, where the company headquarters was located. The Western Federation of Miners, he told reporters, introduced its agitators and organizers into the district, knowing that Mexican workingmen are easily intimidated, and has exercised its arbitrary and despotic methods to bring suffering and loss in a formed happy and contented community. 13. Even Arizona papers friendly to the companies could not buy this argument. They noted that the strike was a process of long, slow growth, and that the WFM organizer had merely touched the match. Others pointed out that the real reason for the strike was indicated by the banners inscribed, Viva la Unión, borne by the Mexican Americans. 14. After two committees of strikers had been refused a hearing by the managers on the ground that they included Western Federation of Miners representatives, a third committee was appointed which succeeded in getting the companies to a conference on September 26. But the conference did not last long. It became apparent soon after it started, a mine manager told the press, that the committee was composed of hand-chosen delegates of the Western Federation of Miners, and under these circumstances, a conference was useless. The managers then issued a joint statement notifying the strikers and the public that the mines and plants will remain idle indefinitely. The statement continued. When it shall appear that conditions in this section warrant it, and the companies are satisfied that the general sentiment of the community and their former employees is unanimously in favor of a resumption of orations on the basis of wages and conditions that have prevailed heretofore in this district, the companies reserve the right to themselves to decide whether or not they will again start up their plants. But while they closed the mines which had already been shut down by the strike, the managers were making plans to reopen them with strikebreakers. The mining companies established a camp at Duncan, Arizona, several miles distant from the strike district. All former workers, they announced, who did not wish to join the union or to continue on strike, were invited to appear and enjoy free board and lodging at company expense. 16. Company managers appealed to Governor Hunt. Having made arrangements to resume operations in the future with strikebreakers, the three managers boarded a train and fled the strike district to Texas. Before departing, they issued a statement asserting that they had been forced to leave for fear of their lives because of the lawless and desperate Mexican strikers, and appealed to Governor George Wiley Paul Hunt to send the state militia to the strike district to protect lives and property. Newspapers in various parts of Arizona and even outside the state published the statement under the heading, Mine Managers Flee for Their Lives, and backed up the call for state troops. 17. In the Colorado coal strike of 1913-1914, Governor Ammons, at the behest of the Rockefeller interests who controlled the mines, had ordered the state militia to the strike district. This began a bloody process which was climaxed by the tragic Ludlow massacre and the crushing of the strike. The mining companies and leading Arizona newspapers were confident that the chief executive would follow the Colorado precedent. But Governor Hunt proved to be a different kind of chief executive, in fact one of the most unusual in American history. A poor boy who had become a prospector, ferry boat operator, writer, rancher, and banker as well as an 8-term territorial legislator. Hunt had presided over the Constitutional Convention when Arizona became a state in 1912. As the state's first governor, he set out to ally himself with organized labor and progressive elements among the farmers, ranchers, and the middle class. At the time when a strike seemed imminent in the Clifton-Morenci-Metcalf district, Hunt made a public speech in which he warned that in the event of a strike, the companies should realize, we are to have no repetition of Colorado here. Hunt also warned workers that he would not countenance any violence on their part. Referring to the notorious bullpens of Colorado where strikers had been imprisoned under appalling conditions by the militia, he announced that if any were established in the strike district, he would see to it that both strike agitators who threatened violence and managers who imported strikebreakers and thus incited disorder, would go into them. 18. Meanwhile, Governor Hunt attempted to achieve a peaceful solution of the dispute through arbitration of the differences between the employers and miners. But every effort in this direction came to nothing, chiefly, Hunt declared, owing to the seeming unwillingness of the mine managers to make any compromise on every one of the workers' demands. 19. Governor Hunt's unusual response. When the strike began, Governor Hunt immediately sent an agent to the strike district to investigate. General John Harris, Adjutant General in command of the state militia, followed. Both reported that the strikers were orderly, that they asked only for a conference with the managers to discuss their grievances and that these grievances were real. Meanwhile, they also reported, the strikers, having dispersed the company's guards, had placed pickets in the mines, converters, powerhouses, and smelters to prevent their being operated. Moreover, Sheriff C. Cash of Greenlee County, having only 4 deputies, had appointed several strikers as deputy sheriffs, and had sent them to guard the mine properties. What is more, he had forced the companies to pay their wages as deputies, and Foner, History of the Labor M.L. Emmett in the United States, Volume V. pp. 196-213. Watchman. Thus, Governor Hunt was informed, these men appeared in 2 roles as strikers and as deputy sheriffs. Under this arrangement, there was no need for state troops to be sent to the strike district except for the purpose of standing watch. 20. Governor Hunt acted on this recommendation. The militia was sent to the strike district, but with instructions to cooperate with the strikers in protecting property. Soon company spokespersons were denouncing the fact that officers of the state militia, in the pay of the state and stationed in the strike district ostensibly to preserve law and order, are engaged in drilling strikers in military formation and tactics so that they may function efficiently as deputy sheriffs. 21. Meanwhile, Governor Hunt was becoming concerned by reports that the camp established at Duncan by the companies to receive, lodge and feed anti-union workers was really a center for strikebreakers being recruited from outside Arizona. Hunt sent Adjutant General Harris to investigate. Harris found that carloads of non-union workers had arrived at Duncan from El Paso, and convinced by this and other evidence he considered conclusive, he reported to Hunt that these men had been imported into Arizona as strikebreakers. Governor Hunt immediately announced that he would not tolerate strikebreaking, and ordered the militia to prevent any strikebreakers from entering the strike district. This order remained in effect throughout the strike. 22. So unusual, so remarkable was the position he had taken in industrial conflicts on the eve of America's entrance into World War I, that Hunt was flooded with requests from newspapers and magazines to explain his stand. His most detailed response was to the survey. In it he wrote, in part, everyone concerned with the strike situation was allowed to understand that the importation of hired strikebreakers or gunmen would not be permitted. In taking this position, I found my justification in the firm conviction that under our present industrial system controversies between employers and employees are virtually inevitable, and that when such unfortunate differences arise, the preservation of life and property acquires importance paramount to all other issues. It was, moreover, my honest belief, as it still is, that no intelligent body of workingmen will voluntarily initiate the certain hardships and risks of striking unless they are first convinced their grievances are just and their cause is entitled to conscientious consideration by their employers. It may, in fairness, be conceded, as has been demonstrated time after time in the industrial history of this country, that the importation of strikebreakers by the employers under conditions above described is nothing short of an invitation to violence, and, in fact, almost surely presages bloodshed and other disastrous consequences. It will, of course, be understood in this connection that when a strike is initiated on a large scale in any mining or manufacturing district, an unusual condition is at once created, and cannot always be controlled by narrow adherence to such technical interpretations of law and individual claims of constitutional rights as may ordinarily be successfully upheld. By way of illustration, it may be pointed out that during a serious industrial trouble, the voluntary advent of strike breakers in a district, even though effected under the guise of exercising constitutional rights, is virtually a precursor of violence endangering the lives and property of everyone residing within the strike zone. In such an emergency, I would be impelled to place the constitutional right of protection guaranteed every law-abiding citizen under our government as being a more important consideration than the upholding of the claim of the strike breaker to the privilege of seeking employment wherever he pleases. In brief, during a strike, actualities rather than theoretical contentions for individual liberties must be successfully dealt with if violence and bloodshed are to be prevented. 23. Hunt did not act alone. Sheriff Cash cooperated, and together governor and sheriff wrote new pages in American industrial history. When the company managers fled the strike district, Cash wired the authorities at the Texas border that the three were guilty of having incited to riot. By their departure, the strikers fearing that the mines might never again be opened, he urged that they be brought up on charges, and they were actually brought before a justice of the peace. But they were discharged. The managers then made their way to El Paso, where they established headquarters for the next 4 months. From El Paso, they issued statements denouncing the strikers for lawlessness, and it was from El Paso that they arranged for potential strikebreakers to be sent to the camp at Duncan, Arizona. But because of Governor Hunt's order to the state militia to prevent strikebreakers from entering the strike district, they were never used. 24 shortly after the strike, Waller Douglas, general manager of Phelps Dodge & Company, argued that the companies had never planned to use professional strikebreakers, and TLJJT the only men at the camp in Duncan were employees who refused to join the union and THC strike. The reason the camp was established, he said, was solely to assist such faithful employees. New Republic, March 18, 1916. Hunt replied, with reference to the concentration camp maintained by the companies at Duncan, Arizona, I can hardly PBCE credence in Mr. Loveless's assertion that the objects of this camp were purely philanthropic. A National Guard officer of Mexican birth, who in the guise of a Workham M. Gain, L. admission to the Duncan colony, reported in writing on his return that previous employment by the companies was not a prerequisite for enjoyment of the privileges of the encampment, and that it was understood by the campers that as soon as their number should acquire sufficient proportions, they would enter the strike zone and go to work. The officer reported further that he was not questioned concerning previous employment, NT by the companies. Ibid. April 15, 1916, page 293. After the manager's departure, Sheriff Cash appointed more strikers as deputies, and had them join the others in guarding the abandoned mining company's properties. Again, too, the companies had to pay their wages. Clifton, Morency and Metcalf have never been more orderly than during these weeks when the Stricketts have been functioning as deputy sheriffs, one New York reporter wrote to his paper. 2s. Strike settled under community pressure to reopen the mines. The managers finally agreed to meet a strikers committee in El Paso, provided they were first given the opportunity to scrutinize a list of the names and select those who were acceptable. The strikers submitted 15 names, and the managers picked 5 whom they said were acceptable. The 5 went to El Paso on October 15 and held a 3-day conference. At the end, however, the managers declared that the committee was so handicapped by Western Federation influences that its efforts were unavailing. 26. Now the companies tried a new strategy. They began a campaign in the press denouncing Governor Hunt as IWW Wobbly sympathizer, who was misusing his office in the interests of alien terrorists from Mexico, and called for his immediate recall. Indeed, recall petitions were circulated, but Hunt had gained the support not only of organized labor but of many ranchers, merchants, and farmers. He was able to expose company payment to newspapers for printing items vilifying him. The campaign to recall Hunt fell flat. 27. While strikebreakers, gunmen, militiamen, sheriffs and their deputies, the array of forces relied upon by corporations in their battles with unions, could not be counted on in the Arizona copper strike of 1915 to bring about a settlement favorable to the mining corporations, hunger threatened to accomplish the same result. The Western Federation of Miners had not officially approved the strike, and severely weakened by the DF feed in northern Michigan, was unable to pay out money for strike benefits. Thousands of strikers, with their wives and children, became dependent on credit from local shopkeepers. But as the strike dragged on, these merchants were forced, one by one, to shut up shop and leave the district. This situation, the companies were convinced, would force the strikers, already facing the pinch of starvation, to capitulate. 28. They were wrong. Few of the strikers left for Duncan, where they were assured ample food and lodgings in return for having abandoned the strike. Governor Hunt issued a proclamation inviting contributions to the relief fund, and he called on the state militia to solicit and distribute necessary supplies to needy families of the strikers. Reporters who had covered many bitter labor struggles were astounded to see militiamen gathering and distributing food and clothing for the strikers' families, and they wrote that the best of feeling prevails among representatives of law and order in the strikers. What made this especially remarkable, they noted, was that Anglo-American militiamen were assisting Mexican-American strikers. 29. Strike funds were obtained through voluntary contributions of sympathetic labor unions and individuals in Arizona, and from appeals in other states to aid the strikers. One appeal noted, The resources of the miners cannot compete with the resources of the companies, and unless we aid them, they will have to capitulate on the corporation's terms, namely, to go back to work and abandon their union before any talks of reform or betterment can be held or even the slightest concession made. 30. After 4 months without a serious break in the strikers' ranks, the companies were forced to surrender. The final settlement was produced by 2 federal mediators sent in to mediate by the U.S. Department of Labor Hywel Davies and Joseph S. Myers. The settlement, reached on the 19th week of the strike, provided for the elimination, as far as possible, of all distinctions between Americans and Mexican Americans. A minimum wage equal to that paid in the best mining camps of Arizona. A general advance of 20% in wages to 80% of the workers, and the payment of better wages to skilled workers. The withdrawal of the company's objections to union representation. The re-employment of former strikers without discrimination, except in a few isolated cases of an unusual nature, the outcome to be settled by arbitration. And the establishment of an arrangement whereby differences between employers and workers would be discussed in conferences at least once a month by representatives of both sides. The first issues to be discussed at such conferences concerned the petty tyrannies of the foreman. 31. On January 12, 1916, the Bisbee Review reported that the strikers had voted unanimously to withdraw from the Western Federation of Miners and to apply to the State Federation of Labor for membership. A major factor in the decision was the unwillingness of the Western Federation either to endorse or fully to support the strike. The State Federation accepted the strikers, and the former locals of the Western Federation of Labor were affiliated with the Arizona State Labor Federation. George Powell, WFM organizer, wished the miners well in their new home. In leaving the district, Powell had words of praise for Governor Hunt and Sheriff Cash. The workers of these great United States have been given the worst of it by the governors and sheriffs in labor troubles so often and for so long, that now when we get a square deal, we think that we are getting it all, and on the other hand the companies have wholly or in part controlled those officers for so long that when they are told to obey the laws of the state and county or go to the bullpen, they feel they are getting a rotten deal. We are proud of our state, our citizens and governor. We are with him in his efforts to enforce the state laws, and in closing we will say, bravo George Hunt, bravo Jim Cash. 32. After the strike. When the managers returned to their homes from El Paso after the strike settlement, they were forced to concede that all of the statements they had issued about terrorism and vandalism on the part of the strikers had been without foundation. Although they had left their homes unlocked and unguarded 4 months before, not one article had been disturbed. Piles of loose lumber had not been touched, although the strikers, the majority penniless and near starvation, had been forced to go into the mountains to cut firewood. During the strike, the workers had been called incendiaries, but it was now revealed that when a mill began to burn, the strikers sounded the alarm, formed a bucket brigade to fetch water from a neighboring creek, and worked to check the blaze. One striker suffered severe bums in helping put out the fire. 33. No word of appreciation came from the mining companies. On the contrary, they continued their campaign of vilification of Governor Hunt for coddling terrorists and arsonists, and began a major campaign to defeat him for re-election. 34. But Hunt had many supporters not only in Arizona but outside the state as well. Mother Jones called him the greatest governor that the country has ever produced and stumped Arizona for his re-election. A number of leading journals hailed him as having shown the way in which strikes could be conducted without bloodshed, namely, by banning strikebreakers and professional gunmen. The outstanding feature of the copper miners' strike in Arizona is that a strike lasting 19 weeks and more has been managed without violence, declared the Outlook. For this Governor Hunt was responsible, and for this he deserved national prominence. 36. International prominence, too, for not only was Hunt unusual for facing a well-financed corporation campaign, Hunt was defeated by Thomas Campbell, who won by 30 votes out of 15,000 cast. Hunt contested the result, and the state Supreme Court ultimately gave Hunt the majority of the 30 disputed votes, and Campbell was deposed after serving about half of the 2-year term. Allen v. Johnson, Governor G.W.P. Hunt and Organized Labor, unpublished M.A. thesis, University of Arizona, 1964, pp. 76-85, James R. Kluger, The Clifton-Morenci Strike. Labor Difficulty in Arizona, 1915-1916, Tucson, 1970, pp. 181-84. Having prevented corporations from using the state militia in their interests and bringing strikebreakers and gunmen into the district to defeat the strikers, but he had done so when the vast majority of the striking miners were Mexican Americans, workers who were usually held in contempt by corporations and governors alike. Hunt gave credit to Sheriff Cashforth's unusual stand he had adopted ing the strike, but he singled out the labor movement for special praise. In virtually every instance the union officials responded to my urgent admonitions against disorderliness, and many went so far as actively to assist in preventing lawlessness. Instead of being cast against organized government and communal peace, the labor union's influence became an important ally in the discouragement of overt acts. Thus the nature and extent of the union workingmen's cooperation as a factor in one of the most serious industrial troubles that ever arose in the United States may be readily realized, and so far as I am concerned in my official capacity is gratefully acknowledged. 3 feet. Chapter 3. A Steel Strike, a Riot and an Unusual Sequel. On Saturday morning, December 30, 1915, readers of newspapers all over the United States were shocked to see on their front pages underneath headlines reading, "Alien Steel Strikers Set East. Youngstown on Fire," an account of how a mob of strikers in East Youngstown, Ohio, enraged by the fatal shooting of 8 strikers and the wounding of 12 others by gunmen hired by the Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company, had suddenly turned themselves loose to burn and pillage and destroy, and had not stopped until 4 complete city blocks and parts of other blocks had gone up in flames and were utterly destroyed. They also read how the mob had burned the property of the Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company, where the strikers had been employed, and that of neighbors and fellow countrymen of the men on strike, that of merchants where they shopped, a bank, and the post office. The story continued with the news that by 9 o'clock Friday night, the property damage was estimated at over $300,000 and the blaze was still beyond control. A call had been sent to the Youngstown Fire Department, but the officials refused to send the firemen, saying that they were not assured protection from the angry mob of strikers. When an earlier attempt had been made to put out fires, the rioters cut the hose and refused to permit the firemen to check the blaze. When the headline in the Socialist New York Call was different. It read, "Shooting Down of Strikers by Private Police Infuriates People, June 8, 1916. East Youngstown Arson. What made Kem do it?" was the question on everyone's lips. Chat. December 30th. Many answers were offered. One was that Bloody Friday had occurred because Chat Friday was the Austrian New Year. Many steel workers had emigrated from the Austro-Hungarian Empire and had gotten dead drunk on Chat Day. Another was Chat the violence happened because Chat Day was the Jewish New Year, and a few days before many strikers had seen Israel Zangwill's The Melting Pot at the movies. No explanation was offered to show the connection, but it was assumed that the point being made was that the conception of the melting pot, depicting America as a land which brought various peoples together, offering them a haven and a home, and an opportunity to become something better than they had been by enabling them to throw off their slave-minded European heritage and becoming Americanized, clashed with the reality of life in the steel mills, causing the angry outburst. 2. In the end, however, most commentators placed the blame for the East Youngstown arson on the fact that it was in the nature of immigrants from southeastern Europe to become drunk and act violently. But Chester M. Wright, editor of the New York Call, the Socialist Daily, who spent days in Youngstown and East Youngstown studying the situation, wrote, "It never occurs to them that the industrial system might have something to do with it, that hours of work, wages, profits, juggling, speculation, any of the 57 kinds of deviltry that the capitalist system can play might have had something to do with causing men to say to the bosses, 'You go to hell, we don't like the way things are going and we're going to strike until we do.'" 1. Developments in steel. Despite all the theories devoted to drunkenness, it soon became evident that the steel industry had almost invited the blind, angry response of its workers. Chat had occurred in East Youngstown, Ohio on December 29, 1915. Not only did the industry, and especially its major corporation, U.S. Steel, aggressively boast of its success in maintaining an open shop, but the whole industry had a long record of lengthening the working day and reducing wages. In the 1880s, Carnegie Plains had experimented with the 8-hour day, but, after completion of Mecca, 1 Israel Zangwill, 1864–1926, British Jewish novelist and playwright, and Zionist leader. The image of America as a crucible wherein the European nationalities would be transformed into a new race owes its origin to the tide and theme of Zangwill's 1908 play, The Melting Pot, which was transferred to the screen in 1915. Nization, the employers, using the excuse that the hard work had disappeared from most of steel production, turned to much longer shifts. Forcing through the extensions during economic depressions, the employers instituted 12-hour shifts in much of the industry. This began at the Edgar Thomson Works in 188-7, and spread to other plants in different parts of the country during the first decade of the 20th century. In a period of economic boom, Sunday labor came to be added to the workweek in response, as David Brody puts it, to the cry for more steel. By 1910, 30% of all steelworkers labored on Sunday in the working week, according to figures compiled for Illinois, was 7 hours more than it had been in 1882. Once every 2 weeks, workers in many departments put in a 24-hour, long turn, for. At its 1909 convention, the AFL passed a resolution calling for thorough organization of all branches of the steel business. Although the AFL did launch a campaign to carry out the resolution, anti-immigrant sentiment, craft organization and craft jealousy plagued its organizing drives in the industry. The AFL approach was hardly the best method for organizing in a mass production industry in which immigrant workers of different nationalities, and especially those from Southeastern Europe, played an ever-increasing role. At the same time, mechanization and the change in the division of labor were diluting craft expertise and creating a wide range of semi-skilled and unskilled job classifications. The AFL unions committed only 6 organizers to the steel effort and had lost enthusiasm for the project when a strike for shorter hours at Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, in 1910 presented new opportunities for changes in Stj.5 at Bethlehem Steel Company. Skilled workers had a Saturday half-holiday, but they worked 10 hours and 25 minutes each of the other 6 days, 68 hours per week. The less skilled complained of a 13-hour, 20-minute workday. Since 1907, the company had refused to pay time and a half for overtime. On February 3, 1910, some of the skilled mechanics at Bethlehem struck, demanding an end to Sunday work and time and a half for overtime. Shortly thereafter, unskilled laborers and apprentices joined their ranks. With the aid of AFL and International Association of Machinists organizers who enrolled 3,800 members nationally during the strike, the local craft unionists actively pursued unity with the unskilled workers, most of whom were Hungarian immigrants. Not only did many laborers stand by the machinists through much of the 108-day strike, but, more amazingly, the skilled workers refused a separate settlement which ignored the unskilled. Pants at its peak. The promise, in the words of the strike chairman, that, "We are going to win. We are to have our nights to ourselves, and the Sundays also," was realized in part. Overtime and Sunday work became optional as a result of the settlement, but wages remained unchanged and so low that long hours remained a necessity. 6. The unity of skilled and unskilled, of Americans with the immigrants, had already had a precedent in the Great Strike of Workers of the Pressed Steel Car Company at McKees Rocks, led by the IWW, in July, 1909, a strike which ended in favor of the men. Although the Bethlehem strike was defeated and a summertime 10-hour initiative at McKees Rocks failed, the events of 1909 and 1910 changed labor relations in steel. Reformers, especially the members of the Federal Council of Churches and the Pittsburgh Survey Group, publicized conditions in steel mills relentlessly in the wake of the McKees Rocks and Bethlehem strikes, pointing to the 7-day labor and the 12-hour day. The mankilling system, as the New York World called it. An article in the January 1913 issue of Metropolitan, depicting the heavy labor in the steel mills, concluded, "Had you thought of doing that for 1 hour? And then for 2? And finally for 12 hours? Had you? That is the barbaric 12-hour day which obtains in the steel industry." 7. The entire industry, according to David Brody, stood implicated. The AFL and the reformers forced a full-scale investigation of the steel corporations by the House of Representatives, during which Louis Brandeis testified to the fact that the terrible conditions of labor are the result of having killed or eliminated from the steel industry unionism. It is a condition of repression, of slavery in the real sense of the word, which is alien to American conditions. The investigation won significant support for requiring the 8-hour day on government-constructed steel. Of course, the welfare of the steel workers was not the only consideration favoring introduction of the 8-hour day. The superintendent of the Judson Manufacturing Company of San C. Philip S. Foner, History of the Labor Movement in the United States, New York, 1965, Volume IV, pp. 282-95. The Pittsburgh Survey drew its staff from settlement houses, charity organization societies, ethnic organizations, and universities. The staff of the survey formed an assemblage of experts with Paul U. Kellogg as its director and John Fitch one of its most important analysts. The Pittsburgh Survey was published first in 3 special monthly issues of Charities in the Commons, beginning January 2, 1909, and then in Paul U. Kellogg, editor, The Pittsburgh Survey, 6 volumes, New York, 1910-1914. For a summary of the work of the survey with a critical analysis of its backward approach to immigrant workers, which viewed them solely as competitors, who retarded the wages and working conditions of the native, see John F. McClymer, The Pittsburgh Survey, 1907-1914. Forging an Ideology in the Steel District, Pennsylvania History 41, 1974. 169-86. Francisco, one of 54 structural steel companies in that city to switch to the 8-hour day in the summer of 1916 in response to a demand from the Structural Steel Workers Union. Asterisk stated that on the 8-hour day, production will be increased from 14%, and that overhead expenses, cost of oil, lighting, etc. will be reduced. The men are far more efficient, more willing, more capable of first-class work under the new system. Directly in charge of the work here as I am, I have been in a position to closely observe the new order, and I can safely make this unqualified statement. A worker can and will do more work in 8 hours than in 12.8. Perhaps most crucially, the craft structure was beginning to give way in steel. As Brody points out, the experience of 1909-10 held enormous future importance. The question of union structure was settled. All steelworkers, skilled and unskilled in every branch of the industry, excluding blast furnace workers, would be under a single jurisdiction. 9 established craft organizations, e.g., bricklayers, kept jurisdiction in the mills, but all jobs peculiar to the steel industry were to be under one amalgamated jurisdiction. Semi-industrial unionism committed to organizing the ethnic unskilled had come to steel. When ambitious AFL organizing returned to the mills in 1913, with a goal of union recognition and the 3-shift system of 8 hours, agitational literature was printed in 13 languages. In listing the reasons for the abandonment of the organizing campaign in iron and steel in 1904, the AFL organizers assigned to this work gave as a leading cause the fact that a large number of the workers we approached are foreigners, hardly able to speak or understand the English language, thereby complicating and, in the end, nullifying our efforts at every point. But McKee's Rocks and Bethlehem had proved that immigrant workers could be organized, and one of the most important means of organizing them was to use their own languages. Conditions in East Youngstown and East Youngstown, Ohio, were ripe for the new organizing drive. The Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company had more than 8,000 men on its payroll in East Youngstown. In Youngstown proper, the Republic Iron and Steel Company employed about, however, 10 structural steel firms rejected the union's demand, and with the aid of a newly organized Law and Order Committee, began operating an open shop with scab labor on the old 9-hour day. By December 1916, these companies were forced to surrender. Stephen C. Levi, The Battle for the 8-Hour Day in San Francisco, California 11771 IA. History 57, 1978, 343-53. 6,000 men, and the Carnegie Steel Corporation another 6,000. The plants of all 3 companies were strung along the Mahoning River, which made its way through the city of Youngstown and the village of East Youngstown. Both Youngstown companies had plants in other parts of the country, and the Carnegie Company was part of the United States Steel Corporation. But Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company, around whose plant the village of East Youngstown had been built, was an independent company, most of whose stockholders lived in Youngstown. 11. Youngstown, with its suburbs, included about 100,000 people. A third of the total population, it was estimated, consisted of foreigners, chiefly Poles, Lithuanians, and Serbs. East Youngstown was not part of the city of Youngstown, but a village with its own government, 3 or 4 miles from the square, which was the heart of Youngstown. The Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company of East Youngstown was the largest plant in the entire district. The company prided itself on its welfare work. President J.A. Campbell instituted a voluntary system of compensation for accidents, and later supported a compulsory state law. The plant was viewed as a model for safety, and its hospital in East Youngstown was considered to be excellently managed. 12. However, welfare work did not include decent wages for the steel workers, especially the unskilled, the vast majority of whom were immigrants. President Campbell frankly told reporters that the question of living standards and the needs of the workers had nothing to do with wages and should not have anything to do with them, but wages were and should be met by competitive conditions. 13. With this approach, it is not surprising that wages in the district were hardly sufficient to stave off hunger. In 1910, a government investigation showed that 70.8% of the steel workers at Youngstown and East Youngstown were of foreign birth, that only 48% of these worked 9 months a year or over. That of 330 families investigated, the heads of families earned an average of $440 a year, of whom 40% earned less than $400 a year, and 14% less than $200 per year. Since 1910, wages had advanced 10% by the fall of 1915, but the cost of living, according to the United States Bureau of Labor Statistics, had advanced more than 12% in the same period, and wages had been totally inadequate in 1910. Poverty was so widespread in the steel districts that in 1913, according to the United States Census, 41% of deaths in Youngstown were children under 5 years of age. 14. Some of this, of course, was also due to the wretched housing provided immigrant workers. J. M. Down Charity Organization Society acknowledged that housing conditions in both Youngstown and East Youngstown for steelworkers were abominable, unsanitary to the highest degree, with filth, open garbage, and dry privies abounding. John A. Fitch, who knew steel conditions perhaps better than anyone else in the United States, called housing in the Youngstown area especially terrible. I talked with a man who lived with his wife and 3 children in 2 rooms, for which he paid $7 a month. The other 3 rooms of the house were occupied by a family of 6 who paid $9 a month. The house had running water but no bathroom or toilet. I passed row after row of houses in Youngstown with outdoor privies and with hydrants in the yard. The houses in this section near the Brown Bonnell plant of the Republic Iron and Steel Company were in bad repair generally, and garbage scattered about spoke eloquently of an inefficient board of health. As East Youngstown is a village of more recent origin, one need not be surprised, perhaps, at lack of sewers and running water. The village has been bonded for a waterworks system, I was told, and work is soon to begin upon it. But the mud of the unpaved streets of that desolated village, mud nearly hub-deep, a dinging, all-pervasive mud that plasters itself on shoes and trouser legs, distributes itself over sidewalks, up from steps and across thresholds, a telltale record of a town's perambulations, seems somehow to be symbolic of the community's civic development and its regard for human values. 15. There were other symbols. In 1915 East Youngstown had a population of 10,000 of whom 450 were qualified voters. There was no opportunity in the village for a foreigner to learn English. There were, for example, no night schools. The YMCA at Youngstown had made plans to start citizenship classes, but its efforts were abandoned because of lack of funds. East Youngstown had not a single church building nor any church organization of importance. But the State License Commissioner's report revealed that there were 18 saloons in the village in June 1915. LTHAD grown to 22 by the end of the year, but most of them were burned up in the angry outburst of the immigrant steelworkers. There was no organized social work in East Youngstown. The village employed a visiting nurse for a while in 1915, but it was found to be illegal to spend money for such purposes, so the nurse was dismissed. 16. Perhaps one reason for the absence of churches in a village where the overwhelming number of inhabitants were steel workers was that Sunday work in the mill kept them from attending church services. Moreover, while the standard 12-hour day prevailed at Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company, there were even men who worked 14 hours a day. 11. Hunger and fear of starvation had checked rebellion for years at Youngstown and East Youngstown. Management was sure that there was nothing to be concerned about. Unionism seemed to be as remote a threat as ever. In Sean, management in Youngstown and East Youngstown was slow to realize that with the end of the Depression of 1913-14 and the rush of new orders stimulated by the war in Europe, at the same time that the cutting off of immigration created a shortage of labor, an entirely new situation had developed. A sense of independence swept the steel mills, and worker unrest began to manifest itself daily. Workmen of the most docile tendencies have been making demands, John Fitch reported, noting insignificant little rebellions verging on strikes here and there. 18. It was in Youngstown and East Youngstown that this situation came to a head. Here workers realized quickly that, at last, they could register a protest without facing starvation. All the resentment and bitterness born of years in which excessively long and arduous labor had alternated with shame and humiliation of begging work and bread flamed up in their heens. 19. In other words, after a period of depression and halftime, the steel industry in Ohio, as in other states, had suddenly leapt into a condition of such prosperity that there was a backlog of unfilled orders. In industries supplying munitions, the profits were enormous. In steel, they were soaring, even though management insisted that the prosperity was exaggerated because many of the orders had been contracted for during the Depression months at low prices. What is important is that the prevailing view among the steel workers was that the industry was making huge profits, and that they should get some of it. 20. It was inevitable that such a feeling should emerge. Unskilled steel workers at Youngstown and East Youngstown were earning 19.5 cents an hour. They now demanded a wage increase to 25 cents an hour and double pay for Sunday work. Management was willing to concede half of the demand, but the men would not agree. The strike and the riot. On December 27, 1915, the laborers employed in the tube plant of the Republic Iron and Steel Company walked out. A few days later the whole department, congested with unfinished work, had to close down. JN the summer of 1912, Solidarity, Eastern organ of the WW, reported that the East Youngstown plant of the Y4 greater than Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company is operating at only 65 to 70% of capacity. August 10, 1912. Then men began to walk out of other departments. Most, Why, they were the unskilled laborers, but they constituted the bulk of the labor force in the plants. In a few days the two big plants of the Republic Company were closed down. 21. The AFL organizers succeeded in unionizing many of the men on strike at the Republic plant, and negotiations began again with the company, this time with the workers represented by union committees. 22. When OHNJ Granley, district AFL organizer, attempted to hire a hall in East Youngstown to address the workers at Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company, he was prevented from doing so by the company which hired the hall over his head. 23. As a result, when the men walked out from the plant in East Youngstown, they did so without any union to represent or influence them. The strike at the Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company in East Youngstown began on Wednesday, January 5, 1916. As in the Republic Mills, it began with the laborers and soon was effective in shutting down the plant. The demands made were the same as those of the Youngstown strikers. New with the men out in Youngstown and East Youngstown, there were 15,000 workers on strike. 24. On Friday afternoon, January 7, 1916, a reporter for the Youngstown Vindicator came to East Youngstown with a photographer to take pictures and describe a march planned by the strikers. As he wrote that evening, thousands of strikers were on the streets. Many had been drinking, but they were not in an ugly mood. They posed cheerfully for the photographer. Many were massed near a steel bridge leading over a number of railroad tracks to the steel plant, a bridge which was actually the main entrance to the plant. As the property of the Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company, the bridge was being guarded by members of the uniformed police force employed by the company. There were signs of hostility between the guards and the strikers. Suddenly, the reporter wrote, one of the guards advanced along the bridge and opened fire at the approaching strikers. The strikers started to run, and when they had reached a safe distance, they stopped. At this particular spot there was a pile of bricks, and when the crowd surged forward again, many of the strikers carried a brick or two. Suddenly a brick was hurled at the 25 private guards, whereupon the leader of the group opened fire with his revolver, and his companions, taking this as a signal, poured a volley into the strikers. 20 of the strikers and 2 bystanders fell, 8 of them fatally wounded. The crowd then became a wild, angry MQB. An amazing destruction and pillage of 6 square blocks in East Youngstown followed, and did not end until the smoking ruins of an estimated $1 million worth of property remained as a memento of the fierce anger of the strikers. Only with the arrival the next day of 2,000 members of the National Guard, who patrolled the streets with fixed bayonets, was order restored. Explanations for the riot. Explanations for the riot, as we have seen, came fast and furious. The Outlook, however, refused to use the word riot, preferring that it be called by its true name, private war, that is, a private war of armed company guards against unarmed strikers. 26. In addition to the explanations we have listed above, there was the charge that the IWW was responsible for the outbreak. But it was soon disclosed that the only visible evidence of the IWW in the strike districts was the scrawled message upon a dingy window of an unoccupied building in East Youngstown reading, LWW 8 hours slaves unite. In general, both authorities and journalists agreed that there was no evidence to indicate that IWW influence was a factor in the rioting. 27. Another rumor was that the AFL planned the riot, and had brought it about by secretly and insidiously preaching violence. This quickly died when it was learned that while the AFL had been active in Youngstown after the men went on strike, it had not even been able to hold a meeting in East Youngstown to appeal to the strikers. Thomas Flynn, AFL organizer in Youngstown, replied to the charge. The men who are on strike are not organized into a union and are not affiliated with any union organization. The American Federation of Labor Representatives will have nothing to do with the strikers because of the pillage and burning of innocent people's property. When the Republic Iron and Steel Company's men went out on strike, we went down there and counseled them to do no violence. They followed our advice. When we learned that the Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company's men were threatening trouble, we went out to persuade them not to do any violence, but we could not even obtain a hall in which to talk with them. The American Federation of Labor does not countenance violence in strikes and will have nothing to do with this one from now on. 2b. Still, Flynn did not entirely wash his hands of the strike. He issued another statement in which he charged that Wall Street interests were behind the riot, seeking to depress the stock of Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company during negotiations for a proposed merger that would include the Cambria Steel Company of Johnstown, Pennsylvania, and the Lackawanna Steel Company of Buffalo. The riot, by depressing the stock, would enable the promoters of the merger to buy the stock of Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company at bargain prices. Moreover, Flynn charged thugs of the worst sort, supplied by detective agencies which specialized in breaking strikes, had been shipped into East Youngstown by the Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company, and that this had been done in the interest of the merger, which, besides it and Cambria and Lackawanna, was to include the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company. The latter company, Flynn pointed out, means John D. Rockefeller and brings up strangely familiar remembrances, 29 such as the Ludlow Massacre. The theory of a conspiracy hatched in Wall Street being responsible for the devastation in East Youngstown received wide publicity. Even the conservative New York Tribune gave it some credence while the socialist New York Call devoted columns to the theory under headlines reading, Wall Street interests pay for Youngstown massacre to force steel merger and buy riot with hired thugs so they could get stock they wanted. 30. The story that followed was by Chester A. Wright, the Callie's managing editor, who had been sent to Youngstown to get the facts about what lay behind the riot, the whole truth about the riot at that place. 31. The Call summed up its managing editor's findings as follows. Briefly, this is the situation. The shares of the Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company were mostly held locally by some 1,300 comparatively small capitalists. A merger was on foot by which the company was to be consolidated with several others, the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company being one of them. Opposition to the merger scheme was rampant in Youngstown, these 1,300, of course, comprising the community and speaking in their name. So the battle lines were set between 1,300 small local capitalists and an unknown but much smaller number of big ones of the Rockefeller type who wanted the merger, while the others objected to being swallowed. How to shake the little fellows loose from stock, how to compel them to come into the merger. Then comes the scheme. The labor dispute is the handiest way. The ignorant foreigners are on hand, also the low wages, the conditions of the class struggle. Foment this, utilize it, and shake the little fellows down. So along come the strikebreaker and the gunman. The agent provocateur circulates among the community, whiskey and rum ad libitum. Then the gunmen get busy, fire a volley into the ignorant foreigners, panic. The torch. Looting, rioting, militia called out, Youngstown stock drops 50 points. And such is the inside story of the Youngstown riot. 32. It was a colorful story, but it did not go far. John D. Rockefeller Jr. issued a statement asserting that the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company was not involved in the proposed merger and challenging Thomas Flynn, who had first raised the charge, to give his authority. Flynn admitted that he had no inside knowledge and offered to send by mail the name of his informant. To this Rockefeller replied that if the name was to be given at all, it should be given to the public. At this the Rockefeller involvement was allowed to die, and even the New York Call did not raise it again. 33. However, as was already dear in the strike against Standard Oil in Bayonne, New Jersey, which is discussed elsewhere in this volume, the shooting down of strikers by company guards was not something that had ceased to be part of the Rockefeller labor policy. A more lasting charge against monopoly capitalists was raised by George P. West, formerly an investigator for the Commission for Industrial Relations, who revealed it in the New Republic of January 20, 1916. West disclosed that the Republic Iron and Steel Company was ready to give its men a 10% wage increase and thus nip in the bud a strike that was being planned. But the company felt it incumbent to consult the United States Steel Corporation before doing so. Elbert H. Gary, chairman of the board of directors of U.S. Steel, advised against an increase. The Republic plant accordingly remained shut down for 2 weeks, and the strike spread to the Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company. Thus it was U.S. Steel which set the labor policy for the entire steel industry, including plants of independent companies. This policy, West charged, was responsible for the fatal events of Friday, January 7, in East Youngstown, H. As we shall see, West's charge was based on solid evidence. The Iron Trade Review, one of the 2 trade papers in the steel industry, noted that the disgraceful scenes in East Youngstown on January 7 were enacted by men of foreign birth, few of whom were citizens, and it suggested that they be deported. It does not suggest, commented John A. Fitch angrily, either deportation or any other punishment for those who have made millions of dollars through the labor of men in the East Youngstown plants, but who have been perfectly satisfied to neglect these aliens who found their presence desirable just as long as they worked and were docile and produced profits. 35. No deportations took place, but 300 men were arrested in the 2 days following the riot, some of whom were immediately telephone-eased for lack of evidence, but not before the authorities publicized the fact that almost all of the men arrested could not speak English. 36. A large number, however, were held for the action of the grand jury which had launched an investigation into the events leading up to the riot. Strike results. Meanwhile, the steel companies made an effort to placate public opinion. President J. A. Campbell of Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company announced that the plant would remain closed for a few days, since operation would be useless. While some of our workers are in the frame of mind they're in now. He had the company gunmen removed from the plant, and promised he would not bring in strikebreakers. At the Republic Iron and Steel Company, the managers made concessions to committees representing newly formed unions. The strikes were called off on January 11 and 13, 1916, and the men went back to work with the understanding that their wages would be raised about 10%. Ultimately, the great majority of the workers received 22 cents an hour instead of 19 cents. What they actually earned would depend as before on the length of the working day and the number of days employed. About 50% of the workers worked a 12-hour day. Before the strikes, a day's work was worth $2.34. It would now yield $2.64. A 10-hour day meant $1.95 before the advance. Now it would bring $2.20.37. Working in the steel industry 12 hours a day in order to make a living leaves little that makes living worthwhile, commented John A. Fitch. Strike is over but Satan still reigns over industrial hell, was the way Chester M. Wright put it. 38. It is worth noting that the increases forced by the strikers in Youngstown spread to the entire steel industry. In fact, the U.S. Steel Corporation had quickly announced a 10% increase the moment the Youngstown strikes broke out. In the midst of a rush of war orders, the industry feared to face the possibility of an upheaval on a scale that might paralyze the entire industry. 39. The sequel. The strikes in Youngstown and East Youngstown had a most unusual sequel. The grand jury had been impaneled to determine the responsibility for the deaths and property destruction that had occurred in East Youngstown on January 7. Contrary to all too recent, this grand jury returned indictments against President J. A. Campbell of the Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company, Elbert H. Gary, Chairman of the Board of United States Steel Corporation, and the following companies: Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company, Youngstown Iron and Steel Company, United States Steel Corporation, and the Carnegie Steel Company. All told, a total of 113 corporations and officers were indicted. They were charged with violation of the Valentine Antitrust Act and Ohio law against conspiracy to fix the prices of commodities, against making an unlawful agreement to maintain uniform wage rates, and against conspiring to keep down wages of common laborers. Maximum punishment under the indictments was 1 year's imprisonment in the workhouse for each of the 62 alleged offenses, and a maximum fine of $5,000 for each offense, or a total of $310,000. The minimum was a $50 fine and 6 months in the workhouse. According to prosecuting attorney A.M. Henderson, efforts would be made in the trial to show that the alleged conspiracy to fix the price of labor by Gary and the steel companies brought about the unrest that resulted in the strike and riot. 40. The grand jury was unable to find any particular cause for the riot, but its report stated that no evidence appeared to indicate that any foreign government had a hand in it. This was a reference to the rumor that German and Austrian agents were behind the riot. It found that members of the Ohio National Guard were employed in the plant of the Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company as guards and that they took ammunition belonging to the state into the plant. The report charged that the riot was precipitated by acts of the Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company. It severely censured the guards who fired from the Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company bridge, killing 8 men and wounding many others, and stated they were not of such a character as to be trusted with the responsibilities that were laid upon them. Concerning the origin of the violence, the report stated, while one shot was fired from one of the mob assembled around the gate of the tube company, the shots which precipitated the extreme acts of violence, lawlessness and crime which were committed January 7 were shots fired by the guards of the Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company. And it continued, we find that there is an underlying cause, not only of the strike and of the dissatisfaction prevailing among the men prior to the strike, but of the riot itself, a cause which will shown upon the trial of some of the corporations and individuals against whom charges have been made by the jury. The grand jury also censured Mayor Cunningham of East Youngstown, 6 members of the East Youngstown Council, and the police force. Mayor Cunningham and the officials were characterized as inefficient and unworthy to hold office. 42. The indictment is an outrage, a travesty, Judge Gary commented in rage. The New York Times agreed, declaring that the indictment made the grand jury and the prosecutor of Mahoning County ridiculous. 43. Samuel Gompers, AFL president, joined the chorus of condemnation, stating that the indictment of the steel companies and Ivan H. Gary on charges of conspiring as a trust to fix the prices of labor was a menace to organized labor. The Valentine Antitrust Law of Ohio, Gompers insisted, was based on the principle that labor is a commodity that can be bought and sold, and he argued, no principle constitutes a greater menace to the freedom and ultimate well-being of the wage earners of our country and our free institutions than does the principle that labor power of human beings is a commodity or article of commerce. 44. This was the first comment by Gompers on the events in Youngstown and East Youngstown. Evidently, the killing of the 8 strikers by company guards did not constitute a menace to the wage earners of the country. There were words of Pr.Is for the grand jury action. Frank P. Walsh, former chairman of the Commission on Industrial Relations, called the grand jury indictment and the determination of the prosecuting attorney to carry it into effect. A hopeful sign that a better understanding and more enlightened sense of justice are abroad in the land. Walsh continued. Without passing on the guilt or innocence of the defendants, we can be grateful to the Ohio officials for their realization that guilt for the fatal riot did not end with the unfortunate victims of economic exploitation who applied the torch, or even with the hired gunmen who fired into the crowd. Almost without exceptions, such outbreaks as that at Youngstown can be traced to the maintenance of inhumane and un-American industrial conditions and the inevitable effect of such conditions in driving the victims to desperation. Now, for the first time, the responsibility of those who maintain such conditions has been recognized, and the public prosecutors have not been content with an attempt to put a few working men in jail. 45. The New York Call, for whom Walsh wrote his opinion, gave the statement a leading place in its columns, but the Call itself was not as impressed by the grand jury indictment and the stand of the public prosecutor. In an editorial entitled, "Mysterious Doings at Youngstown," the Socialist Daily conceded that it was, certainly, a reversal of the usual form, to find a grand jury placing the responsibility for strikes, rioting and incendiarism, upon anybody but the common laborers, and it was a still greater wonder for them to load it upon the shoulders of the Great Steel Trust and a number of other steel corporations and distinguished individuals connected therewith. Indeed, it was as strange as if Colorado had brought a similar indictment against Rockefeller, Jr. and his managers and executives in that state. However, for all that, the Call was confident that nothing would come of the strange and unusual events in Youngstown. There was not the remotest possibility that Gary and his confreres will ever serve prison terms or be mulcted in fines for their illegal conduct. 46. 3 weeks later, the Callie's prediction was fulfilled. On March 28, 1916, Judge W. S. Anderson dismissed the indictments upon representations made by counsel for the defendants. 47. What remained was that the action of the grand jury threw upon the steel companies and their officials the blame for the riot and destruction and removed it from the workers upon whom blame usually is placed. What also remained was the exposure of inhumane and un-American industrial conditions in the steel industry. Such conditions, Scott Nearing pointed out in discussing the indictment, were the result of industrial despotism, and despotism breeds revolt. 48. 3 years later, in the Great Strike of 1919, the revolt came. As for the strike in East Youngstown in 1916, Chester M. Wright summed it up as follows in the American Labor Yearbook. The strike on the whole was one of the most dramatic that the country has known. The complete destruction of so much property, the remarkable solidarity of unorganized workers, and the indictment of company officials as responsible for the result of low wages and unendurable conditions, were features that stamped it as one of most unusual qualities, and worth deep study. 49. Chapter 4. The Standard Oil Strikes in Bayonne, New Jersey, 1915-1916. Dr. John A. DeBrizzi is co-author of this chapter. Several years ago, in a study of the development of American industrial cities, Herbert Gutman criticized the widely held view that, from the start, industrialists had the social and political power and prestige to match their economic forces, and that town politics were a reflection of large-scale industrial interests. 1. Gutman's status conflict thesis. Basing his conclusion on a case study of Paterson, New Jersey, Gutman suggests that big business concerns and their employees have been alien elements within the industrial city for some time. Because of the alien nature of big business in the city and the status resentment of older community groups, particularly small businessmen and professionals, there developed effective opposition to the large industrialists. So effective was this opposition, argues Gutman, that big businessmen were forced to lobby at the state level where local pressures were felt less strongly. 2. Although his research involved a particular case study, Gutman suggests that his findings enjoy a general applicability. 1 or 2 industries characterized the usual New Jersey industrial city, e.g. Bayonne, Hoboken, Jersey City. Although the social history of such towns has not yet been written, sufficient scattered evidence indicates that the presence of vital clusters of urban working-class subculture, a diversity of attitudes among non-workers toward industrial power, and the unique patterns of protest and politics. 3. In the end, Gutman maintains that the social and political processes within the cities of industrializing America are best understood from within a status resentment and conflict perspective rather than from a Marxist-oriented view. The story of the industrialization process in the municipality of Bayonne, New Jersey suggests that Gutman's status conflict perspective is inadequate as an explanation for the events which transpired in the city after 1880, and particularly in the 2 crucial years, 1915 and 1916. Bayonne provides an extremely interesting test for the status conflict thesis in that its economy changed from an agricultural to an industrial base within the span of a single generation. In addition, the local economy came to be dominated by the giant facilities of the Standard Oil Corporation. Thus, if the status conflict thesis of Gutman is of general applicability, it should be confirmed in the case of Bayonne. How Standard Oil of New Jersey controlled Bayonne. In 1880, Bayonne, located on a peninsula at the southern tip of Hudson County, New Jersey, was still primarily a fishing and agricultural center with a population of over 9,000. During the period 1880 to 1905, the population of the city nearly quadrupled, and overnight, Bayonne became an industrial city. By 1881, tax revenues derived from assessments on the Standard and Tidewater oil companies, the latter a Standard subsidiary, provided almost one-half of the monies expended by the city government. Indeed, as Bayonne's economy shifted toward industry, the livelihood of many old families began to depend, at least in part, upon revenues drawn from Standard Oil. This dependence was not forgotten when Standard Oil requested that the city granted permission to lay pipeline necessary for its operation through the community. The first elected mayor of Bayonne opposed the plan, and the oil company actively campaigned against him for re-election. He was defeated at the polls. The newly elected mayor suggested the following to the city council. The Standard Oil Company is a large taxpayer whose interest we should properly care for when possible, and I trust our citizens and property owners will look at this matter in a liberal and proper light, and further this project. 4. When Standard Oil called for an addition to the line and expansion of its facilities in 1881, a group of citizens, prominent among whom were members of the old families, petitioned the city council for favorable action in appreciation of the benefits to Bayonne already derived from the company. The petitioners also cited the fact that with increased facilities still greater benefits will accrue. 5. The council acted favorably on the petition. The Standard Oil Old Family Coalition in Bayonne is understandable when one realizes that, as Random Noble indicates, in New Jersey, the domination of politics by Corporation Machine Alliance had reached its full flower. 6. In April 1915, Bayonne voted in its first municipal officers under a commission government with Pierre S. Garvin, the Standard Oil lawyer, chosen as mayor. In August, it was announced that Standard Oil property investments in Bayonne would increase by $2 million. Clearly, the atmosphere in Bayonne was judged healthy for business. 7. During the periods of July 15 to 29, 1915 and October 10 to 20, 1916, Bayonne was the scene of bitter strikes against the Standard Oil Company of New Jersey. Within a span of 15 months, 14 workers lost their lives as thousands turned out and demanded enough wages to support their families, and attempted to organize unions. Although the Bayonne strikes remained local, they were typical of those resulting from the type of relationship between big business and its workers in West Virginia, Colorado, and Michigan. Typical, too, was the relationship of the Rockefeller interests in the great struggles of the coal miners in the Colorado strikes of 1913-1914. When the Standard Oil Company initially obtained refining facilities in Bayonne in 1877, it employed 20 persons and produced only 600 barrels daily. In the 40-year period of 1880 to 1920, however, the population in Bayonne increased almost eightfold to over 70,000 people. The refinery became the largest facility in the Standard Oil Empire. Until the early 20th century, unions did not represent a significant problem for Standard Oil in Bayonne. However, as the facilities increased in size and more workers were employed, especially foreigners, the company became concerned that it might face an organizational effort to improve working conditions. In 1903, a foreman fired when he interviewed Garvin. John Reed was informed how, during a former term as mayor, Garvin, had increased the tax assessment against the Standard Oil Company's property by some $7,000. It was after this that the company engaged him as attorney, and now the officials of the tax department who make the appraisals of Bayonne property are Mayor Garvin's political associates. A City of Violence, New York Tribune, October 28, 1916, magazine section, pp. 1, 6. Herbert G. Gutman has examined the labor policy of the Standard Oil Company during 1874 and 1877, concentrating on its battle with the Coopers Union as it developed among the barrel makers in New York, Cleveland, and Pittsburgh. In concluding, he quotes a typical Standard Oil worker who describes himself as a serf, as he explains his total lack of power under the domination of the giant Standard Oil Company. Herbert G. Gutman, La politique ouvrière de la grande entreprise américaine de Age du Clinquant, La Sauce de la Standard Oil Company, Mouvement Social, France, 108, 1977, 67-99. The article was written in English and translated into French. Member of the Boilermakers Union, and replaced him with a non-union man. Aware that the union had the sympathy of the men and was preparing to demand recognition from the company, Standard Oil fired more workers and hired replacements, among them professional strikebreakers. The union responded with a strike and a picket line around the company's facilities to keep out scabs. The city and county governments quickly dispatched police to the scene in order to protect the strikebreakers. The Bayonne Herald complained on July 3, 1903, By intimidation and using the county courts as a bludgeon to accomplish its purpose, the Standard Oil Company has set about the task of not only quelling the slight disturbance incident to the strike of its boilermakers, but of striking terror into the heart of any person sympathizing with the strikers. The emerging union in the plant was destroyed, but concerned by the events, Standard Oil introduced a pension plan for its workers and provided benefits beyond those mandated by workmen's compensation laws. Later, Standard extended the pension plan and reduced the length of the work week from 84 to 76 hours. 9 But just in case such concessions should not be sufficient to forestall unionism, Bayonne authorities welcomed Pearl L. Burgo FF, a notorious supplier of strikebreakers, as a resident. For several years Burgo FF had been developing strikebreaking techniques into a refined science, training such specialists as agents provocateurs, spies, and undercover men to operate within the unions themselves. Burgoff recruited his strikebreakers and other operatives from notorious gangs of gunmen, dope addicts, and tough criminals from whom he supplied Standard Oil with all the strikebreakers it needed. But this did not interfere with his becoming one of Bayonne's leading citizens. He socialized freely with political and civic figures and contributed financially to both Republican and Democratic organizations. Mayor Garvin appeared frequently with Burgo FF at a variety of civic functions. That Burgoff would continue to be welcomed by employers determined to uphold the open shop became clear in April 1913 when he furnished strikebreakers to Herman Brothers Company, a small cap-making firm in Bayonne. Jacob Herman, head of the company, refused to recognize a union of his workers, and he turned to Burgo FF for assistance when the men in his factory went on strike. Burgoff quickly complied with the request, and the strikebreakers were escorted to the factory by the local police. Nearly 500 strike sympathizers gathered around the cap factory at a mass meeting and parade on May 1913, and support for the strikers was voiced. Later that month, the Bakers' Union, the Hebrew Benevolent Association, and the Carpenters' Union joined the strikers in petitioning the mayor for support, too, but the former attorney for Standard Oil announced that Bayonne could take care of its interests as regards both employer and employee, without outside interference. While the union represented outside interference, imported strikebreakers did not. By early August 1913, the strike was broken, and the open shop continued. 12 Nevertheless, the capmakers' strike had demonstrated sympathy for and solidarity with the strikers among large segments of the working-class community in Bayonne. That solidarity found expression at Standard Oil in 1915. In keeping with current practice among the leading employers in the mass production industries, Standard Oil mixed the various nationalities in the production departments to prevent solidarity. The vast majority of the workers were foreign-born, and the largest number of immigrants were Poles, with a significant representation of Italians, Russians, including Russian Jews, Irish, and Czechs. Fully 30% of the workers could neither read nor write English, and many also could not speak it. 13. Background for the 1915 strike. Standard Oil boasted that since 1903 there had not been any talk of union or strikes at its Great Bayonne refinery where 5,000 men were employed. This was explained with vague references to pension plans and welfare schemes, all of which proved to be a myth, but when pressed, General Manager George B. Gifford said frankly that it was really because of the company's refusal to deal with any professional labor man or other outsider. Gifford, moreover, boasted of the almost Navy Yard discipline at the refinery, and justified this on the ground that the workmen are unable to speak English, and are of a class requiring firm treatment, and that large quantities of highly inflammable and explosive liquids are stored at the plant. 14. But despite the discipline, dissatisfaction was developing at a rapid pace among the workers at the refinery. Standard Oil paid the yard laborers, a category that constituted the largest group of workers, only $1.75 for 9 hours work, is. Adjoining the Standard Oil Company's plant was that of International Nickel Company, whose product was converted copper and nickel. It employed 1,300 men. Until the summer of 1915, 500 of the labor force worked in shifts of 10 hours during the day and 14 hours during the night, the men changing shifts once a week and receiving 24 hours rest each 7 days. The Bayonne Strike, New Republic, August 14, 1915, page 38. International Nickel paid its common laborers at the rate of $1.80 for 9 hours work. About July 1 its workers asked for an increase in wages. To aid them in negotiating with the company, they hired Paul C. Sapinski, a Polish lawyer with offices in Bayonne and Jersey City. Superintendent Stanley met Sapinski, and after some discussion, agreed to an increase of 10%. There was no strike. Workers at the Standard Oil plant learned that common laborers at the adjoining plant were now receiving 22 cents an hour. Both companies were operating their plants at capacity and exporting heavily to Europe. There seemed no good reason why the Standard Oil Company should pay 19 4/9 cents an hour for the same sort of work that brought International Nickel Company workers 22 cents, especially since the workers knew that the Rockefeller-controlled company could easily afford to provide wage increases from its war profits. In 1914, the earnings of the Standard's Bayonne plant amounted to $3.32,000. By the next year, the earnings leapt upward to $6.5 million, and earned the plant the description of being one of the most profitable enterprises in the country. 16. The growing dissatisfaction at Standard Oil first found expression among the still cleaners, a group of 100 men, nearly all Polish workers, whose function was to enter the stills soon after they had been emptied and scrape from the interior walls the tarry substances left from the distilling process. The still cleaners were paid on a piece rate basis, and earned about $2.25 a day. They worked in the stills at temperatures ranging from 200–300 degrees. To protect their bodies from the intense heat, they wore several layers of thick clothing, and swathed their faces with cloths. During a shift of 7 hours they drank from 10 to 14 quarts of coffee each, to stimulate perspiration in order to withstand better the intense heat. A special grievance of the still cleaners was the treatment they received at the hands of foremen. They complained that the foremen were continuously insulting them, and punished them when they voiced resentment. A common form of punishment was to force the still cleaner to remain inside the superheated vats for extended periods of time. It was not uncommon under these circumstances to see workers carried from the vats unconscious. But all complaints to Standard Oil on this issue were simply ignored. 17. Although International Nickel Company employed no still cleaners, its operation involved similar arduous work, for which proportionate increases had been granted. The still cleaners at Standard Oil decided to apply to the management for a similar increase, and for relief from the tyrannical actions of the foreman. They held a meeting and decided to engage Paul Sapinski to draw up their demands. These included a 15% increase in wages and the immediate discharge of a particularly obnoxious foreman. An answer was to be given in 24 hours. The written demands were presented to Superintendent Hennessy by a committee of 6 still cleaners. Sapinski accompanied the committee when it presented its demands. Superintendent Hennessy refused to hear the demands, launched into a tirade against the committee chairman for engaging an outside agent, discharged every member of the committee, and issued a statement warning the workers against outside agitators, declaring that the company would adamantly refuse to deal with any outsider. 18. On July 15, 1915, all the still cleaners walked off the job, demanding a 15% wage increase and better treatment by the hated foreman. They were joined by 900 coopers who demanded a similar wage increase. On the morning of July 20, the striking still cleaners and coopers gathered at the gates of the plant to urge other workers to join their strike. By 8 o'clock workers from practically every department, firemen, boilermakers, pipe fitters, yardmen, and laborers had turned out and the plant was dosed. 5,000 Standard Oil workers were on strike for a 15% wage increase and a working week of 50 hours, and talk began about forming a union representing all the workers. Later, the adjoining Tidewater and vacuum oil plants shut down, making a total of 7,000 men on strike. 19. Background for anti-labor violence. The position assumed by Standard Oil, or rather by the Rockefeller interests who dominated the company, and the city officials made violence virtually inevitable. A precedent had been established only a few months before. On January 9, 1915, armed guards hired from a Newark, New Jersey detective agency by the Levy Company in the William and Clark plant of the American Agricultural Fertilizer Chemical Company at Crome, New Jersey, fired into a gathering of strikers, killing 2 and wounding 18, 3 of them seriously. One of the dead strikers was found to have 6 bullets in his body. The strikers were mainly Polish workers who were protesting a reduction in wages from $2 to $1.60 a day. As one of the strikers, who testified later before the United States Commission on Industrial Relations, explained, "For 3 years I work all the week and every Saturday too. My wife she take in washing. We have 5 children. I am a Polak and I don't drink, chew, just smoke a pipe. My name is Antonio Wyatter and I work at Liebig's before the strike. They pay $2. Then the boss say, I pay you 1.60, then we strike." 2 things were brought to light following the slayings. One was that the strikers who had been fired upon were unarmed. They simply were butchered, wrote a reporter for the New York World. Even the New York Sun, never very partial to the workers' side in labor disputes, called the shooting wanton and outrageous, while the conservative New York Tribune viewed it as worse than the Ludlow battle in the Colorado coal strike. There the miners were armed and organized for resistance. Here the employees of the fertilizer plants were ready for demonstrations against the strikebreakers, but nothing in the course of the strike went to show that they were armed or organized for resistance to the authorities. When fired on, they attempted no violence in return. Their sole concern was to get away from the whistling bullets. News accounts of the shocking affair declare that nevertheless the sniping at the fleeing strikers continued for some time. What they, the deputies, did differs no jot from cold-blooded murder. 20. The other fact brought to light was that the Rockefeller Foundation was the owner of $500,000 worth of stock in the American agricultural fertilizer chemical company's plant at Chrome where the strike took place. It emerged during the investigation of the unprovoked and wanton shooting of the strikers that Rockefeller dominated the policy of the plant, and this policy with its resulting violence, bloodshed, and death was singularly in accord with that in force in other Rockefeller-dominated plants. Although 10 of the 22 gunmen were indicted for first-degree murder, and 9 were found guilty of manslaughter and sentenced to prison terms, the 10th was acquitted. The use of private gunmen by New Jersey companies continued unabated. As the Newark Evening News noted, the laws of the state have permitted mercenary private agencies to recruit gunmen squads and battalions and hire them out to carry on war in industrial and other labor troubles. It has permitted the imported gunmen to be judge and executives. Such private detective agencies and strikebreakers should be banished from New Jersey. 21. Standard Oil resorts to violence to break strike. But they were not banished. On the contrary, Standard Oil made good use of both anti-labor forces to break the strike at its refinery in Bayonne. Pierre Garvey, mayor of Bayonne, and the lawyer retained by, of course, the women and children killed by the Colorado militiamen in the Ludlow massacre, were not armed. Standard Oil advised the plant general manager to employ armed guards through the services of Pearl Berghoff. George Gifford, the general manager, accepted the advice and instructed Berghoff to get 250 men who could swing clubs and you can break that strike. If that's not enough, get 200 to 2,000. I want them to march up East 22nd Street and right through the guts of the Polacks. 22. At first Standard Oil depended on the Bayonne police force. On July 20th, nearly a week after the strike began, the city police responded to the demand of the company that the strikers be prohibited from congregating on streets leading to the plant, and when the police tried to drive the strikers from the public thoroughfares, the workers fought back. On July 21st, John Stovanchik, an 18-year-old Polish lad, was killed by a policeman's bullet. This enraged the strikers. On the same afternoon, the Standard Oil Company began the importation of 500 armed guards, supplied by Berghoff Bros and Waddell, the detective and strikebreaking agency. 23. The guards were recruited in New York through newspaper advertisements and from among men whose names were registered at the agency's offices. After the strike, Berghoff, the company's secretary, admitted that he did not know most of the guards, as he had been forced to act hurriedly. Even his own attorney referred to the guards as a lot of thugs. 24. By July 21st, the strike had spread to the plant at the Tidewater Oil Company, next door to Standard Oil. Tidewater's management borrowed a force of armed guards from the Standard plant to supplement its own force, composed of non-striking workers armed with rifles. The strikers gathered in large numbers and threw stones and bricks over the walls and through the gates of the plant. Several hundred women, wives and daughters of the strikers, took part in the action, reported the New York Times. The guards replied with rifle fire. 2 strikers were killed and 2 fatally wounded in the unequal skirmish that followed. 25. Covering the strike for the New York Call, Robert Miner paid tribute to the strikers' courage. Rockefeller, he pointed out, fought the miners brutally in Colorado. Patterson textile workers were courageous. Roosevelt, N.J. saw a fierce battle. Lawrence, Mass., was bitterly fought. But Bayonne, N.J. eclipses them all. The Colorado miners had guns. The West Virginia miners, accustomed to hunting, met the hired army of the coal barons as man-to-man. Lawrence was a strike of passive resistance largely. In Bayonne the strikers rushed the battlements bristling. A leading cartoonist in the United States at the time, Robert Miner, sketched a series of moving scenes of the Bayonne strike which were published in the New York Call. The Literary Digest of July 31, 1915 carried 2 pictures dealing with the Bayonne strike. One showed the unarmed strikers being fired at by company guards with rifles with their naked hands. Never in the history of the labor movement, especially in the East, has there been such an exhibition of naked courage. 26. After the slayings, the Standard Oil Company of New Jersey issued a statement from its offices at 26 Broadway which blamed the killings as due entirely to the action of a few professional agitators who are endeavoring to cause trouble among the employees of the company. As for the company, it had adopted the course provided by the laws of New Jersey. The proper public authorities of the city of Bayonne, the county of Hudson, and the state of New Jersey have been duly notified, and the company has no doubt that the situation will very soon improve. 27. This callous statement so enraged Will Durant that he wrote angrily, "I am a timid man, much given to counsel against violence except as a last resort. I know that violence itself is not a solution, but only a voice crying out to heaven for a solution. And I hope that this Battle of Bayonne, as, perhaps, our children will call it, can be won without further shedding of blood on either side. But I say now that we should go to Bayonne, line up with the strikers, and fight by their side for the right to picketing and public assembly. That we should organize ourselves in all our strength of numbers, that if violence is used upon us, we should arm ourselves, law or no law, to resist it. For that is what we have come to. There is no longer any other cheek to turn. 28. Among the men who came to Bayonne were organizers from the International Boilermakers and Iron Shipbuilders Union, the Machinists Union, the Central Labor Union of New Jersey, the Socialist Party, and the Industrial Workers of the World, L.W.W. Evidently the strikers did not trust the AFL organizers to lead them in a militant struggle against the Rockefeller interests. Frank Tannenbaum, leader of the unemployed movement for the L.W.W., and Jeremiah J. Bailey, a young socialist from Elizabeth, New Jersey, were chosen to lead the strike. Bailey was voted chairman of the strike committee, 29 * immediately. Standard Oil issued a circular to its employees printed in English, Polish, Hungarian and Italian, in which it warned the workers to pay no attention to the efforts of professional agitators to induce you to make demands for changes in working conditions and wages. The company is now and always has been, the circular continued, willing to deal with its employees and consider any complaints they may have, but under no circumstances will it deal with outsiders or consider any ultimatum for the role of Frank Tannenbaum in the WW unemployed movements of 191 activities which led to his being sent to prison. Sue Philip S. Foner, History of the L.A. Movement in the United States Volume 4, The Industrial Workers of the World, 1905-1917, New York, 1965, pp. 444-48. Demanding an answer within 24 hours. The circular was posted in prominent places about Bayonne and distributed by hand to all strikers in the streets. 30. Anti-strike propaganda. Even before the strike was fully in motion, Standard Oil proclaimed that a plant shutdown would cause a cessation of oil shipment from Bayonne to Europe, thus aiding the Germans. Much of the keel shipped abroad since the war began is said to have gone to the Allies, the New York Times explained. As the strike continued, the charge that the walkout had been inspired by German agents was raised openly. Paul Sapinski, the local lawyer who assisted the strike committee, was accused of being an agent of the German Emperor. 31. But Standard Oil did not rely only on the German issue. The strike leaders were labeled outside agitators and L.W.W. revolutionists, pointing to the fact that the I.W.W. had been prevented from conducting any meetings in Bayonne in support of the strikers at the Herman Bros. Cap factory in 1913. Standard Oil urged a repetition of these events, and the immediate expulsion of Tannenbaum from the city. 32. As the strike advanced, the local press and even much of the New York press began to portray it as a battle between Americanism versus un-Americanism, and of American versus foreign values. 33. The strike is all the result of foreign agitators, declared the New York Sun. How else explain the fact that the Bayonne force, of 5,000 men, without any experience in unionism, walked out as a solid mass of workers? Who fomented the dissatisfaction? 34. When the New York Times, supporting this position, also asked, who fomented the dissatisfaction? A. S. Martin, describing himself as one of the strikers, replied, "Would it be asking too much of your paper to give a little space to a few of the grievances concerning the Bayonne strike? The still cleaners, who were the first to strike, have to enter a still in a temperature anywhere from 135 to 200 degrees, with iron boots on to protect their feet and gas masks to keep from suffocating, and I have several times seen them carrying out one of their comrades overcome. At the time they struck they were paid $2.50 a day, where at one time they were paid $4 and $6 for the same work. Still, they had no intention of going on strike until the superintendent announced that they were to have their wages reduced 10%. The barrel factory department was the next to strike, and their grievances areofa-like nature. I was in the barrel factory on Friday afternoon, the 16th of July, and also when the first batch of men walked out on Saturday. At 3 p.m. Saturday, July 17th, the thermometer registered 116 degrees, and up to that time, 3 men were overcome by the heat. The day laborer there receives from $1.30 to $1.65 a day, but about half of them are piece workers. Still, for a piece worker to make $2.25 a day, he must work mighty hard. Even at that, their main grievances were the conditions. The men have to work with hot barrels, so hot, in fact, that they wear leather hand pads so as not to burn their hands, so you can get slight idea of the heat that prevails there. Their demands are reasonable enough, as you can see by the papers, but the Standard Oil is only living up to its past policy of absolute terrorism, as you will notice by their declaration that they don't want the federal authorities or anyone else to butt into their affairs. The people are mostly of foreign descent, but more than 3/4 are American citizens. As a rule, they are seldom inclined to strike until conditions get intolerable, for a day lost to them means a great deal. 35. St. and Darrow Oil refuses arbitration. The mention above of federal authorities refers to the fact that on July 23, federal mediators arrived on the scene and met with the strikers' committee. The following day, accepting the suggestion of the federal mediators, the strikers offered to go back to work on Monday, July 26, provided the company would agree to immediate arbitration of the strikers' demands: a 15% increase in wages throughout the plant, a 50-hour work week, time and a half for overtime thereafter, and agreement by the Standard Oil Company not to discharge any of their employees because of their activities in the strike. In response, the only concession made by George B. Hennessy, superintendent of the Bayonne plant, was that if the men came back to work at once, he would use his personal influence to procure consideration of the demands, and that an answer would be forthcoming no later than 10 days from the day the men returned to work. 37. The strikers rejected the offer and voted unanimously to remain out. The decision, it must be kept in mind, came at no small sacrifice, for the workers' families were truly suffering as a result of cancellation of credit by local merchants and businessmen, cutting off all food supplies. Despite all this, the strikers maintained a united front, and given the differences in ethnicity and skills which usually divided them, the solidarity was indeed remarkable. The vote taken on July 25 to continue the strike was taken in English, Polish, Hungarian, and Italian. The vote was unanimous in all languages. 36. Preparing for further attacks on the strikers, the mayor of Bayonne appealed to the governor for state militia. But Governor Felder was angered by the refusal of the Standard Oil Company to submit the strikers' demands for arbitration, especially after they had yielded to persuasion from their strike committee to accept the recommendation of the federal mediators. In a telephone conversation with Vice President Alfred C. Bedford of Standard Oil, Governor Felder told him that as far as he was concerned, the company need look for no assistance from him either in the calling out of armed troops or by official influence. In fact, he would do nothing until the company agreed to arbitration. 3's. Strike-breaking role of Sheriff Kinkhead. At this point, Standard Oil decided to rely upon County Sheriff Eugene Kinkhead to help break the strike. Kinkhead played a bizarre role in carrying out this mission. On the one hand, he and his deputies shot at and beat up groups of strikers. But when he brought local priests with him to try to persuade the strikers to return to work, Kinkhead and the priests were set upon and beaten by company guards. Enraged, Kinkhead called in his deputies, placed more than 100 guards under arrest, and forced them to march to jail through a phalanx of cheering strikers. The parade of Standard Oil's guardsmen who had brutally shot and attacked the strikers enhanced the sheriff's reputation among the workers, and they hailed Kinkhead as their Kresniaset's Godfather. 39. Kinkhead used his newly founded reputation among the workers to break the strike. The New York Call, the leading supporter of the strikers, was banned from distribution in Bayonne, and its local reporter thrown into jail. Walking into a meeting of the strikers, Kinkhead seized Frank Tannenbaum, the L.W.W. organizer, and after physically pummeling the wobbly leader, placed him under arrest for inciting a riot. In an int-review in the New York Evening Mail, Tannenbaum described his experience. In the station house I was searched and locked up amidst abuse and curses from the policemen standing by. 3/4 of an hour later I was taken out and there was the sheriff in an automobile waiting for me with 4 other policemen. Tannenbaum asked Sheriff Kinkhead why he had been arrested, and in reply, he was ordered to take off his glasses. When he refused, a policeman took them off, and then Kinkhead struck him several blows. That was the beginning of an almost continuous series of blows with the hand, club and blackjack from the sheriff and police all the way from Bayonne to Jersey City. I cannot repeat the language they used because it is unprintable. 40. Kinkhead gave Jeremiah Bailey, chairman of the strike committee, the same treatment. He was beaten, thrown into an automobile, and arrested on the charge of being both an outside agitator and a German agent who had started the strike to prevent Standard Oil from selling their product to the Allies. Beatty vainly denied the charge, pointing out that he had been born in Bohemia, that his sympathies were strongly pro-Allies, and that he had appealed to all Bohemians to lend their support to Germany's foes so that Bohemia might be freed of Austria's rule. All this was beside the point. Sheriff Kinkhead simply forced Bailey out of Bayonne, and threatened him with a long prison term if he dared to return. 41. When a reporter complained that Kinkead's beatings and the arrests of Tannenbaum and Beatty were illegal, the sheriff shoo back. "I don't see care that there was any law or not. I was there to protect life and preserve the peace, and I'd have killed Beatty or Tannenbaum or done anything else if I thought it necessary." 42. The New York Call denounced Kinkead, the Kaiser of Bayonne, but Standard Oil was perfectly happy company have a Kaiser working for Chemco break the strike. Indeed, the company empowered Kinkead co-sell the strikers that if they abandoned their strike leaders, followed the sheriff's advice and returned to work, their demands would be considered. Of course, no written agreement to this effect was made, but the sheriff was proud to be Standard Oil's leading strikebreaker. 43. Standard Oil was not the only one to lavish praise on the vigilante-minded New Jersey sheriff. J. E. Roach, special representative and general organizer of the American Federation of Labor, who went to Bayonne from Washington as the representative of Samuel Gompers, publicly declared to Sheriff Kinkead, "I want to compliment you, Mr. Sheriff, for your action. We are fully in accord with you, and your actions up to this time have been fully in accord with the ideas of law-abiding citizens and for the best interest of the country. Your advice to the men to return to work in view of the promises of the company to you to increase their wages and better their working conditions was wise counsel. We have every confidence that the Standard Oil Company will treat with its employees through you, Mr. Sheriff, according to the proposal you have read to them. We highly appreciate your services. 44. The strike is broken. It is incredible that an American Federation of Labor organizer would hail a strike-breaking sheriff as a spokesperson for the workers at Standard Oil. By the time this statement was made, Kinkead had demonstrated his true role. When the strikers refused to break ranks and accept his proposal that they return to work with his assurance chat, the company would consider their requests once they were back on the job. Kinkead called the American workmen to a separate meeting in private, and urged them not to allow themselves to be used by enemies of the United States. He closed his impassioned plea. "If any man not a citizen here is not satisfied with conditions in this country, in God's name let him go back to the other side." 45. The Assembly of Native-born Workers decided to let the sheriff work out a deal for them with Standard Oil, and voted to resume work. As news of the break in solidarity reached other strikers, morale sank, and 1,500 of them came forward to express readiness to return to the plant and place the outcome in the sheriff's hands. With the strike committee gone, its members forced to resign by Sheriff Kinkead, and defections mounting, the workers voted an end to the strike on July 28, 1915. For the first time in the history of the country, John Fitch commented, "A sheriff, playing a lone hand, had broken a strike." Even the New York Times conceded, however, that Kinkead's actions in terminating the strike, which affected 8,000 men of the Standard, Tidewater, and Vacuum Oil companies in Bayonne, NJ, left in its wake cries that he was exceeding his authority. 46. None of these cries, however, came from the officials of the American Federation of Labor. Some concessions to workers. A few days after the men had returned to work, the Tidewater Oil Company announced an increase of 15% for common laborers and other increases for the more skilled workers or those engaged in more arduous labor. Standard Oil followed this with a wage increase of 10% for those paid $2.50 a day or less, and a 25 cents a day flat increase for those earning above the $2.50 daily wage. In addition, the company reduced the work week from 5/4 to 48 hours, but mainly for the English-speaking, skilled workers. 47. At the same time, Standard Oil began firing all members of the strike committee and all strikers who had been most active on the picket line. Moreover, anyone who had dared to talk of the need for a union in the plant was instantly discharged. It was disclosed, moreover, that an informal agreement had been reached between the company and Sheriff Kinkead under which no complaints would be raised against the dismissal of those who had opposed law and order. 48. Obviously, anyone who talked union fell into that category. Having granted some concessions to the strikers and increased the FAIR of dismissal among those who favored unionism, Standard Oil was confident that it had no Foner problems to concern it at the Bayonne plant. There was still another reason for Standard Oil's confidence. The 1915 strike had shown that the workers' militancy could be diffused by the issue of Americanism. In the event of another strike threat, this technique could be used to split the ranks of the workers soon after the walkout got underway, and was bound to discourage them from attempting another battle with the powerful Rockefeller interests. In one respect, namely, the value of Americanism in splitting the ranks of the workers, Standard Oil's confidence was proved justified. But it took only a little over a year to shatter the illusion that the breaking of the 1915 strike had ended all determination of workers at the Bayonne Standard Oil plant to achieve a decent way of life. A new walkout. On October 4, 1916, 600 paraffin workers at the Standard Oil refinery in Bayonne, New Jersey struck for a 20% increase in wages. On the following day, 35 pickets appeared near the refinery to distribute circulars urging other workers to join the walkout. Instantly the Bayonne chief of police appeared, to announce that all outsiders who attempted to address the workers would be arrested on the spot. At a meeting of 1,500 striking workers and sympathizers on October 6, resolutions were adopted declaring that if the demand for a wage increase was not met, a general strike would be called. 49. On October 7 a strike committee was formed by representatives of workers from the case and can department, the pressmen, yardmen, stillmen, and firemen. The men were mainly foreign-born and the meeting was conducted largely in Polish, Hungarian, and Italian. 50. Split in the ranks of Saint and Road oil workers. It was thus obvious in 1916 that the strategy employed by Standard Oil a year before to split the American and foreign-born workers was paying dividends. After conferring with Standard Oil officials, English-speaking craftsmen announced that they would not join a general strike. At a mass meeting of English-speaking workers at Standard Oil, Daniel Boyle, a bricklayer, told the assembly, "I can say for the bricklayers that we have been treated fairly and squarely. A year ago at the time of the strike the company said that if we would return to work we would be cared for. Shortly after we returned we were granted a 5 and 10% increase in salary. Shortly after this the company voluntarily gave us an 8-hour day. The present trouble is being fostered by professional agitators, we believe." 51. The Bayonne Evening News reported with hearty satisfaction the stand taken by the English-speaking workers in denouncing the strikers and praising the company. Moreover, it editorialized, "It is a significant fact that the only men advocating a strike at the present time are of foreign birth, who are not sufficiently acquainted with the English language to attend the meetings where addresses were made in that tongue. It is evident that there will be no general strike at the big Constable Hook plant this time." 52. Standard Oil rejects strikers' demands. Despite the fact that they were abandoned by the English-speaking workers, the foreign-born strikers determined to continue the struggle, and on October 9, a meeting was held between a committee of 9 strikers, representing the men who had walked out, and the superintendent of Standard Oil's Bayonne plant. The committee presented the company with a petition which read, "Gentlemen, we, your employees of the various departments hereafter named present the following amicable request, feeling reasonably certain that if you consider the conditions under which we are compelled to work, and the prices which we are asked to pay for the commodities of life, you are bound to realize that our demand is fair and reasonable. First, we request an increase in wages in all departments, except the still cleaners, in which wages have been raised and are adequate. Second, we request an 8-hour day be adopted throughout. Third, that fairness be exercised in discharging men, and that men will not be discharged without just cause. Fourth, we request street humane treatment at the hands of foremen and superiors, in place of the brutal kicking and punching we now receive without provocation. Fifth, we request 20 minutes for lunch in the press department. 53. Hennessy brusquely replied that the company C2 would afford no wage increase and warned that the plant would be shut down if any trouble occurred. On the next day the plant was dosed, and 4,600 men were locked out. Hennessy explained that the shutdown was necessary because of the provocative and unreasonable demands of employees. 54. In the process, of course, even the English-speaking workers were forced out of work. From the beginning of the BAT 1E, the authorities of Bayonne resorted to violence and mob law to break the strike. Once again the mayor of the city proudly announced that he was the attorney for the Standard Oil Company and that he will not approve any action of the police required to break the strike. Superintendent Hennessy issued a statement asserting, "We have absolute faith in the authorities in the city of Bayonne." 55. Police mob violence in Bayonne. The faith was amply justified. In the early morning hours of October 10 a squad of police detectives broke into a meeting hall used by the strikers and arrested and imprisoned a group of workers. At the same time, police, firing weapons and wielding clubs, forced strikers and sympathizers away from the Standard Oil plant into a residential area. The police then marched into the area and forced people off the streets, fired shots into the homes of workers, routed patrons from working-class saloons, and searched houses and individuals at will. 56 as one onlooker reported to an investigator. "That man Katie, the chief of police, is a bird. He led the bunch of cops in there and put everybody off the street. Nobody dared to say a word, or he got smashed over the head. A fellow was standing in a doorway, and Katie laid him out with the butt of his revolver. The man's wife came out to the door and threw her arms around Katie to protect her husband. He just grabbed her and threw her back boldly through the door. 57. The procedure launched on October 10 became a daily practice. On October 13, the New York Times, under the headline, Bayonne, rioters held in check, gave an account of the method adopted by the police to break the strike. The police, reinforced by 100 special deputies and 30 firemen, had ranged the district where lie the homes of the striking workers of the Standard Oil Company and other plants in the Constable Hook Station, herding strikers into their homes, wrecking saloons that had disregarded the order to close, and striving in every way the police knew, to fill the mob with a great fear of organized authority. The little armies marched through streets thronged with strikers. To each they gave the same order, get off the street, and they emphasized it with a flourish of their weapons. At the slightest hesitancy on the part of the crowd, the policemen fired. They fired into the air intentionally, but the crowds broke and fled. Even a head at a window brought a shot purposely aimed to miss but to come too close for comfort. Get in. And on October 21, 1916, the New Republic published an unsigned article entitled, Newspaper Incitement to Violence, angrily accusing the New York press of having so falsified its headlines as to convey the impression that the local authorities, whom its own strike reports proved, deliberately adopted a policy of intimidation and violence for the purpose of breaking the strike, were heroically upholding the law against a criminal mob. It cited the above New York Times headline as an example, and also such headlines as, Bayonne rioters loot stores, out 11 Al, New Bayonne mob clubbed out of captured. R. Station, Mail. Bayonne strikers apply torch to many buildings, Globe. Bayonne strikers renew their threats, Evening Post. Oil strikers begin looting. Rioting mobs hold Bayonne, Evening World, and strike mobs rout police, loot and burn in Bayonne. The New Republic then commented, not a single one of these things happened. Page 285. Keep away from the windows and off the roofs. We'll choose to kill next time, cried the police, SS. They did choose to kill, and 8 strikers were killed by the police, as well as a bride of 3 weeks, while many strikers were wounded. Death to oil strikers, the order, read the headline in the New York Evening Telegram of October 5, 1916. The previous day the strikers had attempted to circulate a handbill which read, to the workers of Standard Oil Co. Fellow workers. The strike is on. Wait your committee's decision, be in a peaceable manner, do not congregate on the streets and corners. 4,000 workers of Standard Oil Company of Bayonne are on strike. Be peaceable and maintain order. 59. Strike Committee. The police immediately arrested anyone carrying a leaflet and distributors were threatened with guns. Hence the headline in the Evening Telegram. The Strike Committee was forced to withdraw the circulars. 60. In an effort to persuade the police to adopt a more moderate position, a committee of the strikers went to the municipal building with the proposal that they be permitted to appoint a committee of 300 to do patrol duty in the strike section, put down any disorders, to keep the crowds from congregating in front of the plants, and to compel the saloons in that section to remain closed. The police brutally informed the strikers committee that they had enough machine guns mounted on the roof of the Standard Oil plant to slaughter any strikers who dared even to picket in front of the buildings. 61. Yet every commercial newspaper in New York City gave the impression that it was the strikers and not the police who were practicing and threatening violence. On October 11, the New York Globe carried the following story under the headline, Bayonne in grip of a commune, which began, like Paris, in commune days, when men fought behind street barricades and lawlessness was in the saddle, is the city of Bayonne today. Behind 2 barricades a block apart, bristling with paving stones, captured wagons, confiscated ash cans and broken furniture, the strikers and the police faced each other at dawn. 62. In actuality, the only analogy to the Paris Commune was the merciless attitude of the police to the strikers and their readiness to shoot down strikers and their wives, especially if they were foreign-born. The New York Evening Post praised this attitude of the police of Bayonne, and called upon police forces in all industrial areas to learn from New Jersey's uniformed vigilantes. In dealing with the mobs of Bayonne, the police of that city have used STEM methods, the actual club and at least the threat of the bullet. Sterner methods yet are justified and are called for unless the disorder has been quelled. Clearing the streets, entering houses forcibly, putting down all opposition by the force of arms are the only means of dealing with riotous mobs that refuse to yield to milder measures. 63. Representatives of the New York Police Department took the Evening Post's advice and visited Bayonne to get some pointers on fighting strikers. Upon departure, the New York police inspector announced that his visit to Bayonne had been a source of inspiration. 64. Although the New York commercial press reported the strike in Bayonne as if it were the act of an insurrectionary mob rather than a prime example of police mob rule, The Socialist New York Call told the story straight. A. M. Howland, the Callie's reporter, wrote after a visit to Bayonne. I felt last night as though I had just gotten back from the trenches. Only the fellows in the trenches have an incalculably better chance than we had over in Bayonne yesterday afternoon. A trench would have been a most welcome article. Instead, we had to dive for any doorway that was handy, and many of the doorways were locked. Further, we were not always cheerfully admitted to those that were open. It was dangerous to admit strangers to your house over in Bayonne yesterday. Throughout the afternoon there came the sound of volley firing as the police showed no mercy to strikers or mere sympathizers. Under orders from a mayor who was the paid attorney of the Standard Oil Company, they had shot to kill. And they had killed .65. What shall be done with these murderers? Nothing much was done, but at least Amos Pinchot and Dante Barton of the National Labor Defense Council sent the following telegram to the United States Department of Labor. We respectfully urge the Department of Labor to send conciliators or mediators immediately to Bayonne. Something should be done soon to stop the killing and wounding of strikers by policemen, deputies and gunmen in the employ of Standard Oil. Personal investigation warrants this statement. Believe you can do much to avert a reign of terror among thousands of workers who are being terrorized and infuriated by such legalized injustice. 66. 1916 strike is broken. Some efforts were made to put a stop to the police reign of terror. Despite the general ban on outsiders, several AFL organizers were able to gain entry into Bayonne and, accompanied by interpreters, mingled among the strikers. Siding with the workers' cause, the AFL organizers instructed a group of special police deputies recruited from the Teamsters union either to give up their badges or their union cards. 67. But this was a mere drop in the bucket, and the violence against the strikers intensified. On October 18 it was announced that federal mediators from the Department of Labor had arrived in Bayonne. But by the time they entered the city, the English-speaking workers announced that they were starting a back-to-work movement, and under police protection, these workers were escorted into the plant. Bayonne's Director of Public Safety Henry Wilson announced jubilantly, "I've got this strike broken, and we mean to keep it broken." 68. A meeting between members of the strike committee and the federal mediators was held the following day. Given the steadfast refusal of Standard Oil to negotiate or arbitrate on the workers' demands, the merciless attitude of the police and other authorities in Bayonne toward the strikers, and the disastrous effect of the back-to-work movement sponsored by the English-speaking workers, the federal officials counseled the strike committee to abandon the strike. Demoralized and embittered, the strikers returned to work, defeated, on October 20, 1916. "American workers break oil strike" was the jubilant headline in the New York Times. 69. Anti-immigrant bias. It was clear toward the end of the strike that the anti-immigrant bias already stimulated by Standard Oil in 1915 had become even more bitter in the following year and prevented the development of solidarity among the workers. Fred and Race War in Bayonne Strike, the New York Times headline of October 19 shrieked, and the subheadlines explained, English-speaking workers declare readiness to face thousands of foreigners. Police pledged to give aid. The use of the term, race war, was clarified in an observation by John Fitch, who wrote in Survey, "As I looked the situation over in Bayonne, it seemed to me that the issue here is primarily one of Americanism. It is tremendously significant that in the language of the street there are two classes of people in Bayonne, white men and foreigners." 70. Bias against immigrant workers was also used to justify the violence and intimidation visited upon the strikers. As one small businessman in Bayonne put it, "It's the strike, a case of the ignorant, low-class foreigner making trouble. This is an orderly, prosperous and comfortable town. Those fellows live over by themselves and refuse to become Americans. They live in dirt and filth and hoard their money. This is the first time that I have said a good word for the Standard Oil Company, but I am with them on this deal." 71. John Reed on the Bayonne strikes. Noted radical reponer John Reed not only had no good word for Standard Oil, he blamed the giant corporation for the outrageous violation of the rights of the workers employed in the refinery and the use of anti-immigrant bias to justify this action. Reed's article, "A City of Violence, a Lust," aided by Boardman Robinson, appeared in the magazine section of the New York Tribune, October 30, 1916. Too late, unfortunately, to be of any aid to the strikers. Reed demonstrated clear, why and concisely that the Bayonne police, working on behalf of Standard Oil, were the rioters and the strikers were the wholesale victims. Reed began, "Bayonne, NJ, with all its varied industries, is dominated by Standard Oil. The heavy, acrid smoke of the refineries hangs over it like a pall, and to the southward the great tanks, chimneys and buildings of the Standard Oil plant and the works of half a dozen allied corporations, the Tidewater Oil, Texas Oil, Vacuum Oil, Bergen Point Chemical, etc. loom like a smoking city above the other factories of Constable Hook and the terrible slums where the workmen live. As to these slums, Reed wrote, between 19th Street and 25th, and from Avenue E to the tip of Constable Hook, is the dwelling place of these people. They live packed in ramshackle tenements, many of them wooden, in 3- and 4-room flats, for which they pay outrageous rents. Often a man, wife, 6 children and 9 boarders will live in 3 rooms, the boarders working in 3 different shifts, one rising from his filthy pile of rags to go to work just when the other comes in worn out from his shift. There are no sanitary arrangements whatever in most of these places, except a common shed in the backyard. Water is procured from a nearby common pump. The best flat I saw in *, the Bayonne Evening Review insisted that given the composition of the strikers, the behavior of Standard Oil and the local authorities was necessary. This condition was created by the unlicensed and unbridled action of perhaps no more than 300 discontented workers, who were doubtless inspired to their activities by a hereditary impulse to wreck and ruin when the restraints of their native environment was changed to the wide freedom in their new homes in America. October 20, 1916. The Hook itself had 4 rooms, a common toilet in the hall, 1 cold water tap in the parlor, and cost $20 a month. These driven cattle, unable to speak English, unable even to communicate with each other, forced to the last desperate remedy by hopeless debt and slowly tightening starvation, went on strike. They were forbidden by the police to hold meetings, except to say whether or not they would return to work. Their leaders, such as they were not allowed to address them. Reed also emphasized that the strikers got the Rockefeller treatment. There is a similarity in all these Rockefeller strikes, which springs from the similarity of Rockefeller industrialism everywhere. In Bayonne, as in Colorado 3 years ago, I find that the policy of the company has been to keep the great mass of laborers ignorant and disunited and every man's hand against them. Among the unskilled workmen, Americans and English-speaking men have been replaced by Polacks, Slovaks, Lithuanians, Russian Jews, Italians, and their racial and religious antipathies given full play. Everywhere he went in Bayonne, Reed found the American, English-speaking workers blaming the immigrant workers for the troubles in the plants, an attitude which he regarded as a tribute to the diplomacy of the Standard Oil Company and the stupidity of the American working class. He found another thing. For the first time in an American industrial dispute, the police officials announced that their object was to break the strike. And from the first night, when 100 officers, armed with riot guns and repeating rifles, marched down to the Hook to demonstrate the futility of striking, to the workmen, the object of the Bayonne city authorities was to drive the strikers back to work, in every way the police knew. 72. The strike was broken, 8 workers lost their lives, and another 25 were seriously injured. Standard Oil of New Jersey became a model for big business on how to use the issue of Americanism and radicalism as effective weapons to keep unionism out. As the historians of the Standard Oil Company of New Jersey put it, the very wording of Jersey's public statements was that employed by other businessmen faced with identical situations in other companies and in other industries. 73. In the end, the workers gained nothing by their strike. Indeed, insult was added to injury when, 1 month after the end of the strike, an asterisk the New York Call summarized Reed's article, and paid the young reporter the highest compliment by commenting, "Reed could not have been more truthful had he been writing for the Call." New York Call, October 30, 1916. Industrial parade was held in Bayonne to mark the beginning of a week-long community celebration. 8 AFL craft organizations participated in the affair, but not a single strikers group was represented. 74 The event symbolized the gulf which Standard Oil had forged between the native and foreign-born and skilled and unskilled workingmen. Nevertheless, Dante Barton, New York representative of the Committee on Industrial Relations, * warned the American people and American big business to learn some important lessons from the Standard Oil strikes in Bayonne. As for the American people, is it not time that the American people should awaken to the essential brutality of millionaires and billionaires running their business on the principle that they cannot and will not pay their hardest-worked workers enough to give them a decent living? Ought we any longer to have business on terms in which it is considered respectable for that sort of treatment to be given to workers? The majority of these Polish workers receive now $2.50 a day, which, with the increased cost of living, does not give them enough for a profitable living. And as for big business, when these Polish workers have the ambition and the fine qualities to strike against that degraded condition in life, gunmen and special policemen, armed with guns and machine guns, are rushed against them, and the workers are abused because they have manhood and courage. This sort of industrial injustice, if it is not cured and overthrown, must necessarily lead to the kind of revolutionary disorder that men like the Rockefellers and Morgans consider so terrible. Men like these are sowing the wind and they will reap the whirlwind. 75 The Committee on Industrial Relations was organized to continue as a private organization some of the investigative work formerly conducted by the United States Commission on Industrial Relations and was headed by Frank P. Walsh, who had been the commission chairman. During the early months of 1916, with a group of progressive friends, Walsh also formed the National Labor Defense Council. The lawyers who were members of the council were to be available to advise local lawyers in any defense case arising out of a labor struggle where their aid could be useful. Mariotto Walsh to Frank P. Walsh, January 26, 1916, Frank P. Walsh Papers, New York Public Library. Chapter 5. The New York City Transit Strike of 1916, the First Phase. In 1916, the major transit companies of New York City and Westchester were faced with the most militant bid for union recognition and improved working conditions that the workers had made in 20 years. Their union, the Amalgamated Association of Street and Electric Railway Employees of America, AFL, ordered a strike on the surface lines in Westchester after management refused to arbitrate. The strike on these lines, owned and operated by the Third Avenue System, rapidly spread to all the surface lines in Manhattan, Bronx, Queens, and Richmond, shutting down all surface transit in the city of New York, with the exception of Brooklyn, and creating what one historian has called the era's greatest industrial crisis. 1. Previous struggles of transit workers. As far back as the 1880s, New York City transit workers complained of their working conditions. Too many hours to work. Read a headline in the New York Times of January 1886, and it went on to report that the drivers have for a long time past complained that they were overworked, being obliged to stand on the front platform in all. The Third Avenue Railway Company was the center of a group of roads that were generally called the Whitridge System after Frederick W. Whitridge, president of the Third Avenue Railroad. The Third Avenue Railroad Company, the immediate predecessor of the Third Avenue Railway, was founded October 8, 1863. Its original length of route was about 8 miles, but from time to time, its route was extended until it became a veritable network complementing and supplementing the metropolitan system. By 1906, the company had just about gone into bankruptcy, and 2 years later, Frederick Wallingford Whitford was appointed receiver. Kinds of weather from 15 to 17 hours a day, and being only allowed a few minutes in which to eat their dinner. They were afraid, however, to demand a reduction of hours of labor, lest the company should discharge those who made the request. Many efforts were made in the subsequent years to end this and other forms of extreme exploitation, but they usually failed. A major effort took place in Brooklyn, then a separate city, in 1895. 5,000 men, employees of the trolley railway system of Brooklyn, and organized in the Knights of Labor, struck to raise wages from $2 for a 14-hour day to $2.25 for a 12-hour day. The company used the police to protect scabs and beat up strikers, but the Brooklyn police force was not powerful enough to break the strike in view of the great public sympathy for the carmen. As a popular song of the day, Brooklyn T. Rowley, put it, "Of the trolley strike I now will sing that's caused so much ado, and try to show both sides of the facts and story true. How, we'll first take the monopolist with all his cars and cash, who'll stand no arbitration, but declares the nights he'll smash. The next we'll take the poor man, working 14 hours they say, who asks only honest wages, $2.25 a day. Judge for yourself, is that too much the rich man to them pay? The men who run our trolley cars 14 hours a day, too." The company had enough influence, however, to persuade the state government to call in the militia and troops of the 23rd Regiment. The state guards charged the picket lines with fixed bayonets and succeeded in breaking the strike. 3. This was the last important strike called by the Knights of Labor, but almost a decade later in 1903, the Amalgamated Association of Street and Electric Railway Employees of America appeared on the scene and succeeded in gaining some recognition on the LNTER Borough Rapid Transit and Manhattan Elevated lines. In 1904, when the subway was opened, the Amalgamated along with the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and the Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen won an agreement. This collective contract was terminated before it expired, when new demands were made, and rejected by the company. When the LNTER Borough men struck, at the same time insisting that they were willing to arbitrate, W.D. Mahan, Amalgamated president, refused to support them, and ordered them back to work. When the men refused, the Amalgamated's national officers publicly repudiated the strike, revoked the charters of the locals, and helped defeat the workers. The union practically disappeared in the New York area. 4. In 1905, an unsuccessful strike wiped out the remnants of the Amalgamated and the two brotherhoods from both the subway and elevated lines. In the same year a surface line strike was broken in Yonkers, and later in 1907 another was ended by the company going into receivership. Strikes in 1909 and 1911 were indecisive for the Union, but in 1913, the Public Service Commission, PSC, of the 2nd District, succeeded in bringing both sides together in an agreement underwritten by the PSC, which provided for arbitration of differences between the company and the Union. It was the breach of this agreement which precipitated the walkout in 1916.5. Rampant anti-unionism. Electricity as the motive power was rapidly replacing horsepower on the New York transit system. But this changeover did not alter labor management relations to any extent. Management's determination to run its business without recognition of any trade union remained steadfast. 6. Management, moreover, represented some of the worst enemies of organized labor, men who were pointed to as examples to industry on how to run a company without union interference. Not even the United States Steel Corporation was considered more hostile to organized labor than the great corporations that grew rich upon the nickels of the men, women, and children who used the streetcars and subways of New York City. In addition to hostility to organized labor, U.S. Steel and the New York corporations in transit also had in common the fact that both were dominated by the House of Morgan. 7. In attempting to organize the workers in the New York traction companies, the Amalgamated Association was fighting powerful opponents. The two largest transportation companies, the LNTER Borough Rapid Transit Company, hereafter IRT, and the New York Railways Company, actually under the same management and common ownership, had in 1917 total assets of $230 million and $90 million respectively. August Belmont and Cornelius Vanderbilt, who dominated the board of directors of both the IRT and the New York Railways Company, Thomas P. Shantz, president, and Frank Headley, vice president and general manager, were long-standing enemies of any form of unionism among workers except the Company Mutual Benefit Association under the complete control of the corporations. Headley had behind him the prestige of his victory in the short but bitter subway strike of 1905. He openly declared that he would break any other strike as easily. The record proved it. The years which followed the 1905 struggle were indeed years of bitter defeat for the workers. Intimidation, suppression, flagrant and unwarranted dismissal, unduly long suspensions characterized these years. The cost of living in this period was steadily rising. Yet until the year 1910 wages of the transit workers remained fixed at the same level. Even then it lagged far behind the increase in living costs. A. Working Connell, ITIONS of transit labor. Commenting on the uprising of the New York transit workers in 1916 after so many past failures at strikes and other attempts to organize, the New Republic observed that the revolt came because the intense dissatisfaction with conditions had provided the cohesive cement of group action. The men had exhausted the possibilities of individual effort. There remained only the power of combination. 9. These conditions were truly abominable. Working conditions in New York, declared William D. Mahan, amalgamated president, are the worst in the world, and that goes for Europe too. 10. New York City's transit workers received lower wages than employees of comparable municipal transportation systems. A listing of scales of wages paid on transit lines of 42 major cities in the United States showed that New York City's pay scale was by far the lowest. The LNTER Borough, for example, employed 634 motormen who received $3.60 per day for 10 hours of work, 7 days a week. 3,180 conductors and guards received $2.23 per day for a 12-hour day, 7 days a week. 710 ticket agents received $2.26 per day, 7 days per week. 883 gatemen received $1.90 per day, 12 hours per day, 7 days per week. 380 station porters received $1.71 per day, 12 hours per day, 7 days per week. 2. On the 3rd Avenue line, conductors received a wage averaging $2.24 and 25 cents an hour depending upon the particular line they worked on. Their average wage was $867.51 per year, or $9 OT $16 per week for family men. The motormen averaged 25 and 27 cents an hour or $981.01 per year. And the hours of these workers, as reported to the public Service Commission, were 10 per day, 7 days per week, with no holidays, and no vacations. 12. In the case of New York transit workers the hours of work were longer in actuality than those reported. In 1887 the state legislature passed a law providing that 10 hours off labor within 12 consecutive hours should constitute a day's work on street railways. But management simply ignored the law. Workers, notes James Joseph McGinley, gave up hope of any solution from government or management when their 1899 strike failed to win even the legal 10-hour day. 13. New York carmen toiled incessantly long hours. Their basic working day consisted of 10 hours of time actually spent in a car run. It frequently took 14 and 15 hours of working time to receive 10 hours pay. There was no provision for overtime pay. It was not unusual for a man to spend upwards of 80 hours a week to receive 70 hours of pay. This was so because car runs were frequently not consecutive, or because they were split by a 3 or 4 hour break. If a man was brought up on charges of violating some rule, he lost the time spent at the hearing, whether he was found guilty or not. Often a man found guilty was penalized and required to work extra time to make up for his loss of wages. Men were heavily penalized for missing a car run or for failing to obtain the N.Les of YMSs in case of an accident. Frequently when a car was taken off a run, a motorman or conductor would be put to work flagging or switching, for which he received less pay. Men had to purchase their uniforms at prescribed establishments. Motormen and conductors were usually summoned to answer charges, and often they did not know the charge until they appeared. No extra pay was given for instruction on the cars while breaking in a new man, while heavier work on snowplows, sweepers, and scrapers was paid at the same rate as a regular run. 1. Management autocracy. Management's unrelieved autocracy added to the indignity of deplorable working conditions. The IRT's work regulations provided as grounds for dismissal any employee complaint or any failure to discharge exactly and immediately any of an endless list of rules in the regulator's books. As one worker complained, "I wouldn't mind working at the rates as they stand if things were run fairly. But they're not, and the only defense we have is to stick together. You can see what chance one man has against the boss and all his spotters and investigators." 15. But to act together was not easy. The spy system on all the roads, one observer noted, was as elaborately organized as the Tsar's secret police. Any man talking unionism was discharged, and the spies sometimes made it their business to lead the conversation in that direction. Any man grumbling at the company's mutual benefit welfare system or the company rules was discharged. The whole effect was to rid the roads of any trace of unionism. There were some brotherhood men on the IRT from the old steam engine days on the elevated. One by one, and for various reasons, they were discharged. Spies even watched their mail to discover whether they received the Brotherhood's monthly organs. 16. In place of granting a living wage, the transit companies adopted the newly created system of welfare capitalism. Both the IRT and the New York Railway Company instituted sick and death benefits, old age pensions, and as one of its bulletins boasted, it granted passes to the female head of the households. It also encouraged outdoor sports in summer and balls and entertainments in winter. It maintained at minimum cost places where the men could read, play games, and baths. But wages to meet the rising cost of living and even to equal those paid transit workers in other cities, and hours of work less than the 84 often required a week, and the strain imposed by such long hours by metropolitan traffic, such items had no place in New York Transit Company's welfare capitalism. 17. Strike begins in Westchester. The conditions that prevailed in the New York transit system in 1916 would have driven any group of workers to revolt. And at 5 o'clock in the morning of July 22, 1916, the carmen of New York City did revolt. The strike had its beginnings in the outlying towns of Yonkers, Mount Vernon, and New Rochelle. A small flame of unionism had been kept alive in those cities. Through these locals, the Amalgamated Association, the nationwide carmen's union numbering close to 100,000 members working under 250 collective agreements, had kept some influence in the transit systems of the nearby great metropolis. Time and again the Third Avenue Company, of which these roads formed a part, had tried to smash the union, but had failed. The union had come out of every struggle in Westchester still alive. After the strike of 1913, it won a promise to arbitrate all differences, or, at least, the question of whether they were arbitrable was exacted from President Whitridge. 1s. Since the beginning of 1916, however, Whitridge had sought to break Amalgamated's foothold on the Westchester lines. He had unprecedentedly granted 2 voluntary wage increases in February and June. Meeting with a group of his employees, but not as members of a union, Whitridge on June 15 instituted the second wage increase. This brought wages of motormen and conductors to 25 cents per hour for the first year, 28 cents per hour for the next 4 years, and 30 cents per hour thereafter. The union was demanding a flat 5-cent hourly increase, which would bring to 30 cents the wage rate of a first-year man, and to 3 cents his rate thereafter. In other words, the union wanted a man brought to the maximum grade in 1 year, instead of 5. As if to punctuate his refusal to meet with the Union, Whitridge left for Europe even though he knew trouble was brewing, since a vote had already been taken to authorize a strike. William Fitzgerald, Amalgamated's general organizer, whose home was in Troy, New York, where he was a car conductor when his union duties were not required, was in charge of the strike operations for the Union, and had already demanded that the issue go to the Public Service Commission for arbitration. He called Whitridge's impervious attitude a breach of faith, since he was bound by the 1913 truce to arbitrate wage disputes. Whitridge's trip, ostensibly to see his son, who was fighting with the Allied forces in Europe, was really a device to precipitate a strike. 19 As it turned out, the broken pledge and the insolent manner in which Whitridge had ignored the demand of the men for 5 cents more an hour and had sailed for Europe in spite of the workers' request for arbitration, helped create an extremely hostile public sentiment toward his company. On July 22, 1916, streetcar workers in Yonkers, Mount Vernon, and New Rochelle struck their respective companies, the Yonkers Railroad Company in the first, and the Westchester Electric Railroad Company in the latter two cities. Their walkout in Westchester was remarkably quiet. The reason was that, following the bloody strike of 1907, the Board of Aldermen of Yonkers had passed an anti-scab ordinance requesting that every motorman and conductor must have at least 15 days' experience upon the streets of that city under a competent instructor. Mount Vernon and New Rochelle had a similar ordinance. The purpose of the 15-day ordinances was to prevent violence during strikes and prolonged stoppage on transit. They were strongly supported by the Amalgamated, and were popular with the people, since business interests suffered from violence and stoppages during strikes, as well as workers going to and from employment. While primarily a measure to eliminate violence from trolley strikes, it was also a safety measure since strikebreakers were generally inexperienced. The number of accidents in previous strikes where they were emuloid demonstrated this. Violation of the ordinance carried a fine of $150 or 60 days in jail for each infringement. During the 1913 strike, Whitridge demanded that the Yonkers Board of Aldermen rescind the anti-strike-breaking ordinance. They refused, stating that to do so would authorize President Whitridge to import strikebreakers, and strikebreakers would mean rioting and bloodshed. 20. Whitridge then threatened to test the constitutionality of the measure in court, but the strike was ended before he was able to carry out his threat. It is a measure of how ineffective a union the Amalgamated Association was that between 1905 and 1916 it had developed no leader among the carmen either in New York City or Westchester. Moreover, the effectiveness of the ordinance in preventing violence in Yonkers during the 1913 strike and thereby forcing the company to make important concessions on the issues of hours and wages influenced Mount Vernon and New Rochelle to enact similar ordinances. 21. When the Amalgamated struck in Westchester in 1916, the companies returned their cars to the barns, making no effort to run them. Instead, acting on orders given by Whitridge before he sailed for Europe, Leslie Sutherland, 3rd Avenue vice president, sat tight and waited for the cities to act. When Mayor Lennon of Yonkers demanded that the company state why it should not be compelled to run its cars as required under the terms of the franchise, Sutherland replied that the company's hands were tied by the anti-strike-breaking ordinance. Lennon then sent his corporation counsel to Albany to ask the PSC to order the Federal Railroad Company to operate its cars. Such an order would have the effect of setting aside the ordinance. 22. Strike spreads to Bronx. But before the PSC gave its answer, the strike in Westchester had fanned out into the Bronx. Since its formation in 1888, the Amalgamated Association of Street and Electric Railway Employees had been seeking to unionize the conductors and horsecar drivers, later motormen, on the surface lines in New York City, and for William V. Fitzgerald in 1916, the huge metropolis and not Westchester, was the real target. By July 2, 6. Fitzgerald had succeeded in convincing some 1,100 Bronx trolley operators to quit work and join the Westchester walkout. 23. As the walkout moved into the Bronx, President Mahan of the Amalgamated arrived in New York to establish central headquarters, from which to direct accelerating strike activity. At the same time, Edward A. Marr Sr., Chief Vice President and General Manager, took over command of the 3rd Avenue Company's strategy. Marr immediately informed the Public Service Commission that until it used its power to vacate the 15-day anti-strike-breaking ordinance, the 100,000 persons in Yonkers, New Rochelle, Mount Vernon and vicinity who were in the habit of riding the cars daily, would be actually, the work of agitation had been going on secretly for some time in the Bronx so that Fitzgerald did not have much convincing to do. The Westchester strikers had many friends on the cars in the upper borough of New York City who were visited and spoken to, mostly in whispers, in the barns, and even leaflets had been distributed among these men urging them to join the walkout in Westchester. New York Call, August 20, 1916. The strike in the Bronx was precipitated when Vice President Marr of the 3rd Avenue System made a tour of workers' meetings, and had his superintendents take down the numbers of men at the gatherings, who were fired on the spot. Compelled to do without service, Marr received his answer from the Commission the very next day, July 2, 6. Seymour Van Sontvoort, PSC. Chairman, refused to issue an order directing the company to run its cars. Sontvoort pointed out that if the Commission did issue such an order, the company would decline to obey it because of the ordinance. Then to enforce its order, the Commission would be compelled to nullify the ordinance, which it was unwilling to do. 24. On the day preceding the walkout in the Bronx, Marr had herded some 500 strikebreakers into the various barns throughout the borough. The strikebreakers came from the notorious Berghoff agency, which brought violence to Philadelphia in the traction strikes of 1909, 1910, and 1913. Strikebreakers received $5.00 a day, which was almost double the pay of a regular employee. Once the strike began in the Bronx, scab-manned cars ran wild in the streets. Accidents were so numerous that the police officially announced they could not keep track of them. 25. At the outset of the strike in the Bronx, circulars were distributed by the workers. To the public, the striking motormen and conductors of Bronx County ask your moral support in their struggle for better working conditions. The company has imported professional strikebreakers to terrorize us and cause disturbances in the county, thereby casting reflections on the peaceful strikers. Look over the crowds of strikebreakers and see if you see any good citizens of the Bronx. 26. Reform Mayor John Poroy Mitchell and his police commissioner declared at first that it was not the city's duty to break the strike, and that uniformed policemen would not be placed on the cars. But this lasted exactly one day. On July 29, one policeman was placed on each car, making its run. 27. Yet in spite of scabs and police protection of the strike breakers, few cars ran. Bronx residents trudged to and from the subway and the elevated, supporting the strike by refusing to ride the streetcars. Even during the rush hours, only the poorest service was maintained, and by nightfall this was completely abandoned. 28. Strike spreads still further. On Saturday afternoon, July 29, Bronx Borough President Mathewson made an attempt at arbitration. It failed when the Marrs, father and son, refused to meet with the union. 29. On that same afternoon, a meeting *. The Berghoff strike-breaking agency also furnished spies for the traction companies and even had spies working for the companies within the Amalgamated Association. Edward Levinson, I Break Strikes, The Technique of Pearl L. Berghoff, New York, 1935, page 93. Of the 3rd Avenue System was called for the Lyceum at 86th Street and 3rd Avenue in Manhattan. There, amid scenes of enthusiasm, the strike vote for the borough of Manhattan was taken and carried. The resolutions declaring the strike carried unanimously and read, Resolved, that we, the employees of the 3rd Avenue Railway System in the City of New York, do hereby join with our fellow workers of New Rochelle, Yonkers, Mt. Vernon and the Bronx, and do hereby declare a suspension of work, such suspension to continue until the company agree to recognize our organization, and grant us the right to deal with it through the accredited committees and officers of our association, and, be it Foner. Resolved, that we endorse and declare for the wage demands already announced by our fellow workmen on strike, which are that the company shall establish a rate of wages as follows. 30 cents per hour for the first year of service. 33 cents per hour thereafter, and be it further resolved, that we appeal to all of our fellow employees who have not joined us to come with us, and to the public to give us their cooperation and support in this our just contention for our rights as American workmen. The strike is on, said President William D. Mahan of the Amalgamated at the adoption of the resolutions. They have started it, and we will continue it until they meet us as an organized body. 30. During the next few days, while the cars were tied up on the 3rd Avenue System, the organization of thiemen on the other surface lines in Manhattan and on the cars in Queens and Richmond went on. The corporations controlling these lines prepared for a strike. The New York Railways Company discharged 2 men who were known to have joined the union. Mayor Mitchell attempted to persuade the 3rd Avenue officials to submit to arbitration, but he had no more success than had Borough President Mathewson of the Bronx. 31. On August 3, President Shantz of the New York Railways Company was warned that if he refused to recognize and treat with the chosen union of his employees, his trolley lines would be paralyzed. 32. On Friday evening, August 4, the strike was declared on the lines of the New York Railways Company, the Green System, at a meeting at the Lyceum. The strike vote was taken in the presence of representatives from the AFL, the New York State Federation of Labor, and the Central Federated Union, who promised moral and financial support, and after Big Jim Larkin, the militant Irish labor leader, spoke to the Irish transit workers and assured them that they would be upholding the real spirit of Ireland by voting to strike. 33. The term Green Line was used 40 New York Railways Company because their cars were painted green and white. That same night the men on the Queens County cars went out, and the next morning the motormen and conductors of the 2nd Avenue Railroad, the Blue Line, struck without even the formality of a strike vote. In the evening the workers on the Staten Island cars, operated by the Richmond Light, Heat and Power Company, joined the walkout. In all 4 boroughs, Bronx, Manhattan, Queens, and Richmond, the tie-up was complete. No regular service was maintained. 34. Meanwhile, the unionization of the men on the interborough elevated and subway lines and on the Brooklyn Rapid Transit, BRT, went forward steadily. The Brotherhood men on the tubes coming into the city from New Jersey, as well as the powerhouse employees, were contacted and they made it clear they also were ready to go out. It was thus obvious that when the strike call came, it could paralyze the city's main arteries. 35. The Central Federated Union had already pledged its complete support to the carmen. A committee of 30 from the Federation was on the platform at the Lyceum when the strike vote of the Green Car men was taken. General Organizer Hugh Frayne of the AFL was working closely with the amalgamated officials, and Federation President Samuel Gompers spent a day in New York City conferring with Mahan of the amalgamated. AFL local organizer William Collins had cooperated with the carmen since the strike had been called in Westchester, and was to continue rendering assistance in the new walkouts. Local unions, moreover, pledged that no members would ride upon scabman cars, and had adopted rules by which members detected in that act, or even found with transfers in their possession, would be fined. Circulars were distributed addressed to the Union Men of New York, which read, "Union Men of New York, brothers, the streetcar men have plunged into the fight for decency and liberty, for everything that men fight for against greed and oppression. It's your fight as well as theirs. Brothers, it's up to every union man to swing in and help the men on the platforms to come through winners. No union ever wins for itself alone. If they win for all. Now what can you do? Much. You can stay off the cars as, of course, you will. What union man would put his foot on the step of a Fink-run death wagon? He doesn't live, but there's more that we can do. Every union man can make sure that no member thoughtlessly rides on a struck car. Every union can make dead sure of this by placing a fine on any member that does it. That will be just a sign that nothing is being left to chance, nothing left to forgetfulness. Organized labor in New York knows how to rail wide to the support of union men in a time like this. Organized labor knows what battle looks like, and it has yet to shrink from the firing line. Now that the companies have forced battle upon the workers rejoice in the fight, and we rejoice with them. For this fight is going to mean a great victory for a body of fine and loyal men who have been oppressed to the limit of endurance. The Union Forever with Victory. 36. A song entitled, "When We Aid the Streetcar Men," expressed the same sentiments. Now let us give our sympathy and lend a hand to them, who now fight labor's battles, the organized streetcar men. May they and we together hold hands, and let us say, we strike for freedom while we aid those men on strike today. 37. Soon union pickets and union sympathizers were singing the song and wearing strips of cardboard on their hats bearing the legend, "I walk I won't ride in scab cars." Police protection for strikebreakers. But, protected by police, some scab cars were moving through the streets of the 4 boroughs. At the beginning of the strike, the companies demanded that the city assign 2 uniformed policemen to ride each trolley. Mayor Mitchell at first flatly turned down the request. He was determined, he told reporters, to keep the police department clear of the charge of siding with one side against the other in the conflict. But this seemed not to cover the use of one policeman on a car, and Mitchell offered this protection to the companies. 38. The companies rejected the offer. One patrolman on a car was insufficient, since the rear conductor was increasingly being subjected to intimidation and violence. To the extent that the city could supply a second patrolman, to that extent would service be increased. In short, service is a matter of police protection. 39. This did not at first sit well with New York City's reform administration. Deputy Police Commissioner Frank Lord even addressed a strikers' meeting of 2000 at Lyceum Hall to denounce the request for 2 policemen for each car, and praised the strikers for refraining from violence. He noted that despite the complaints from company officials, there had been no real rioting and few outbreaks. Police headquarters confirmed Lord's evaluation, and its own investigation showed that complaints of disorder and intimidation had proved either exaggerated or false. 40. Nevertheless, Mayor Mitchell again yielded to company pressure, and agreed to have 2 policemen placed on each trolley. In part, he yielded because the commercial press, cooperating in full with the companies, headlined stories of violence by strikers that bore no resemblance to the reports by the police. A typical headline, in this case, in the New York Times, read, "Car strikers, raid stops Bronx lines, armed. Yonkers invaders resort to violence enforcing traffic suspension. 41. With this aid, manufactured out of the whole cloth, the transit companies succeeded in achieving the goal of having 2 uniformed policemen assigned to ride the trolley cars. 3,000 policemen were assigned to strike duty. But even the police conceded that when they arrived on the scene, there was nothing but sporadic outbreaks by strikers and no revolvers found on any of them. 42 In fact, much of their work consisted of preventing angry citizens from attacking the scab drivers who ran their cars wildly through the streets. On July 29, a Berghoff strikebreaker ran over a child. Incensed people of the neighborhood, many women among them, chased him down the street, hurling both missiles and epithets at him. The scab was a notorious Berghoff operative who had served time on convictions of grand and petty larceny, and he told the police who saved him from the angered crowd that he had had no experience as a motorman before he began driving the trolley car. 43. The capitulation of New York's progressive, reform mayor to the traction companies angered organized labor. The Brooklyn Central Labor Union denounced the city's police commissioner for having complied with the demand to put policemen on the cars manned by strikebreakers, at the same time proclaiming his impartiality, and this action has been approved by Mayor Mitchell. The resolution went on to condemn the action of the city administration in using police upon streetcars as an unlawful exercise of the police function in the interest of the streetcar monopolies. 44. Company propaganda. No sooner had the companies succeeded in having the city assign uniformed police to ride the cars than they used this situation to reinforce the impression that the transit companies and law and order were synonymous. Despite the hiring of gangsters, despite the fact that collisions and accidents were so numerous as a result of inexperienced scab drivers that passengers risked their lives by riding the cars, the companies kept up a barrage of paid advertisements insisting that they and they alone upheld the principle of law and order. These full-page advertisements, often quoted in approving editorials in the same papers, emphasized that the strike represented anarchy, lawlessness, outside, alien, foreign interference with otherwise loyal employees, who were satisfied with their conditions but were forced to strike by intimidation and threats of violence. Management was not fighting organized labor or the principle of labor unions, other advertisements insisted, but only labor agitators from other cities, who had come to New York to disturb the peace and tranquility of our community. Management was willing to deal with their own employees, but not as members of a trade union or an outside organization of any kind. Management was only interested in running its cars and serving the people of New York City and Westchester, and was entitled to police protection for the safety of its passengers and its property. 45. An indication of the depths to which the companies sank was the attempt to link the Amalgamated Association with the Preparedness Day bombing in San Francisco, which occurred July 22, 1916. Tom Mooney, who was on the Amalgamated payroll as an organizer, was arrested and charged, without a shred of real evidence, with being implicated in the crime. Shantz wired the San Francisco district attorney, who wired back that Mooney was an accredited agent of W. D. Mahan, president of the Amalgamated. He added that he had evidence that Mooney dynamited an electric tower during a recent strike, but did not mention that Mooney had been twice acquitted of the charge and that when the strike failed, the bomb throwing occurred. Mooney's expense account was sent to Mahan. In another report, Fickard added that he did not believe that Mahan had any knowledge of the bomb plot, thus covering himself after having damaged the strike cause in New York City. 46. Role of the Socialist New York Call. While the commercial press did occasionally criticize the traction companies, the strikers' point of view never found its way into their columns, and by playing up the myth of striker violence, the press made it much easier for the companies to present themselves as upholders of law and order. It was only through the pages of the Socialist New York Call that the union and the strikers were able to get their message across to the public. Only the New York Call, for example, published William B. The story of the Preparedness Day bombing and of the Mooney case which followed will be discussed in the next volume. Fitzgerald's answer to the company's charge that the strike was the work of an alien, outside organization, led by outsiders. Fitzgerald noted, "My father spent 4 years and over as a soldier in the War of the Rebellion, fighting to establish the fact that one flag should wave over all the states in this nation, so I leave it to the people of New York City to judge whether I am an alien or not, and I would ask the people to make a comparison with the people that are being brought here now from every state in the Union, to take the places of the men of New York. Of the men they are bringing, many of them carry with them prison records from other states." As to the charge that the Amalgamated Association of Street and Electric Railway employees being an alien organization, Fitzgerald answered by pointing out that it was a part of the American Federation of Labor and has some of the oldest branches in this eastern country. Basically, the transit companies were opposed to any organization, and not just to the Amalgamated. They are today paying the lowest wage of any big city in the United States, because of the unorganized condition. They want to maintain that condition, and that is the reason that they are throwing this dust, as it were, in the eyes of the public, to confuse you, that you may help them keep their street railwaymen in individual slavery. 47. The commercial press continued to help the companies throw dust in the eyes of the public, but only the Socialist Call published the other side of the story. The call did so even before the strike hit New York City, for when the New York Evening World warned amalgamated organizers to keep out of the metropolis, so that the city, just nearing a settlement of labor difficulties in the garment trade, might enjoy a little tranquility just now in business, the call responded, "It is labor's business to determine when to strike. Labor is amply justified in striking whenever it thinks it can gain by striking. To hell with tranquility. The workers are after justice and they can't have justice as long as they are robbed." 48. Once the strike swept through 4 boroughs, the call carried full reports on its developments and editorials in support of the union. It issued appeals for financial support for the strikers, gave the widest notice to strike meetings, and published advice such as, "Don't ride on the trolley cars of the Bronx, Queens, Manhattan, and Richmond, nor those of Yonkers, Mount Vernon, and New Rochelle. A strike is now in progress. Help the strikers by refusing to patronize cars manned by scabs. Do ask every motorman and conductor on whose car you ride in Brook, YN, if he belongs to the Trolleymen's Union. If he says he doesn't, ask him why not. Tell him how the union men of Yonkers and other Westchester cities have steadily improved conditions on the whole 3rd Avenue system. 49. The amalgamated, not noted for its pro-socialist orientation, showed its appreciation at its 1917 convention by answering the Callie's appeal for funds with a donation of $2,000. So, truce settlement. Although the transit companies clearly had the advantage in the battle to win public support by their almost complete domination of the commercial press, there were weaknesses in their stand which helped overcome this advantage. For one TBing, it was clearly contradictory to argue on the one hand that the companies did not oppose labor unions or the principles of organization, but only an alien organization, with alien interests, working for alien purposes, when the amalgamated was plainly the organization chosen by their employees. Again, it was contradictory to state that they did not oppose arbitration, and object to treating with the only organization with which arbitration could take place. The companies received a further blow when the report of the Public Service Commission, signed by Chairman Oscar S. Strauss, laid the entire blame for the 1913 strike on Frederick Whitridge, president of the 3rd Avenue system. It found that there was no dispute that the men on the Westchester and Yonkers lines not only were ready to arbitrate the differences between them, but that they asked for the opportunity to arbitrate them. Moreover, the report found that the board of directors of the road put the whole matter into Whitridge's hands on June 11, 1916, and 2 days later, he sailed for Europe. It was obvious, the report continued, that there was an organization drive on prior to the strike and that it was accelerated by the strike. Moreover, the commission charged that the strike was precipitated by Whitridge's attitude. He had either intentionally violated the agreement he had made with the men to arbitrate following the strike, or he had completely forgot about it, but in either case, he was to blame for the initiation of the wave of transit. The commission's report helped undermine the transit companies' standing in the public's eyes, and their steadfast refusal to budge was further weakened when on the same day, the Merchants Association of New York demanded that in the public interest, the companies meet with the mayor and their employees' representatives, S2. In this situation, Mayor Mitchell met with Public Service Commission Chairman Oscar Strauss, and both agreed to cooperate in working out a pay TCE settlement. The peace terms had actually already been formulated by Mayor Mitchell prior to this meeting, and reflected what has been called middle-class progressivism's basic attitudes toward labor relations and organized labor. This meant that employees have the right to organize and companies have no right to refuse to confer with or to recognize such organizations. But while the right to organize is a fundamental civil right, the union may not exclude anyone from working who refuse to join the organization or to insist upon the closed shop. 53. On August 6, Mayor Mitchell subfated the peace terms to the union's representatives, W. D. Mahan, Louis Fudiger, union attorney, William B. Fitzgerald, and Hugh Frayne, AFL representative, and 2. Shantz and his attorney, representing the New York Railways Company, an LNTER borough subsidiary, but with the understanding that the agreement accepted by the New York Railways would be endorsed by the other companies. Shantz and his attorney had refused to sit with union officials. The opening provision of the 14 Truce Agreement, as it came to be called, read, "The employees have the legal and moral right to organize, and the company pledges that they will not interfere with the employees in their exercising of these rights to organize, either by intimidation, coercion or discharge, nor shall the employees undertake to interfere with other employees in their exercising of their rights to decline to organize either by intimidation or coercion." Management also agreed to the election of a committee of its employees and to negotiate with this committee on wages and working conditions. But it was clearly stated that this shall not be deemed a recognition by the company of the organizations of which they are officers or representatives. Provision was made for arbitration machinery to less than consider all questions not settled by negotiation. Finally, the strikers agreed to call off the strike and return to work immediately, while all strikers would be restored to their pre-strike status without prejudice. The agreement, made up of 5 points, was underwritten by Mayor Mitchell and Chairman Strauss. It remained only for both sides to accept the agreement, the companies through their board of directors and the union through the local memberships. 54. The union claimed the agreement to be a victory for the right to organize without interference, and one for the principle of arbitration, a cardinal doctrine of the amalgamated. The principle was written into the Constitution in the provision that a strike could not be authorized until arbitration had been offered and refused. But management claimed that it had secured the victory because it was not bound to recognize any trade union. In fact, on the very day following the acceptance of the truce agreement, Shantz asserted that it was not to the interests of the New York transportation system that his employees should be affiliated with an organization with interests in other cities and not responsible as we and our employees are to this community. 56. Nothing, in short, had happened during the strike or discussions leading up to the truce agreement, which had altered in the slightest the company's opposition to the right of their employees to belong to a union of their own choosing. They had thus committed themselves to nothing, and it seems incredible that the amalgamated officials were willing to accept such an arrangement with companies whose underhand dealings were notorious and of long standing. That the agreement left the workers exposed to attack was apparent to anyone who viewed the terms realistically. The New York Call, for example, at first greeted the settlement with a sense of euphoria, labeled it as proof that the day of the union has come, and joined the editor of the New York World in congratulating Mayor Mitchell on his peaceful in quoting this remark by Shantz. Samuel Weitzman adds the pertinent comment. This statement was made just after Shantz emerged from a meeting where the board of directors, whose interests ranged from coast to coast, 2 of them living in Boston, 200 miles away. The directors included financiers with interests certainly not confined to Westchester in New York City. The New York City Transit Strike of 1916, unpublished M.A. Thesis, Columbia University, 1952, page 41. Even more astounding is that the amalgamated leadership had been willing to accept several revisions President Shantz made in Mayor Mitchell's terms. These included 1. A guarantee by the union not to coerce employees who declined to organize. 2. Explicit refusal to recognize any union or outside employee organization. 3. A clause granting management absolute control, not subject to arbitration, of employees in all matters relating to efficiency. It was Mayor Mitchell, not Mahan and the other amalgamated negotiators, who persuaded Shantz to drop his extreme demands. W. D. Mahan, William B. Fitzgerald, and Louis Fudigerdo. Mayor John P. Mitchell, August 6, 1916, Theodore P. Shantz to J.P. Merchell and Oscar Saraus, August 6, 1916, John Poroy Mitchell Papers. New York Surrey Mayoralty Office, Surrey Hall. Melvin Dubofsky Nors that Mahan. Surprising. Why accepted? Shantz revisions. He has only words of praise for the settlement terms advanced by Mayor Mitchell, and treats them as meriting the highest praise. When workers organize. New York City in the Probe-Meve era, Amherst, Mass. 1968, pp. 135-136. Termination of the most serious labor problem that ever concerned New York. 57. But as it studied the terms of the settlement, the call grew alarmed and issued a series of warnings. It warned the transit companies. If your workers have to strike again to compel you to live up to your word, it will not be good for you and your system. The people of New York would then vote overwhelmingly to place the entire traction system under municipal ownership. So Mr. Shantz, Mr. Headley, Mr. Belmont, you had better be as honest as you can. 58. For the transit workers it had this warning. A counterattack is coming, and unless the men consolidate, they are likely to lose all they have and perhaps more. 59. As we shall now see, this was no idle warning. Chapter 6. The New York Transit Strike of 1916, the second phase. By August 8, 1916, all the companies involved in the strike had signed the truce agreement, in the form accepted by the New York Railways Company. But just as the union spokespersons were expressing unbounded optimism that the truce gave them the greatest organizing victory in 24 years, the IRT management had already launched a company union movement to head off and undermine any organizing drive by the amalgamated. Even before the truce had been signed, on August 3, the LNTER Bureau Management held a mass meeting with 2,000 of its employees who were greeted by a white uniform company band, and addressed by Shantz and Headley. At this gathering, management announced the formation of the Brotherhood of IRT Employees to maintain management labor harmony. The workers were urged to select a committee which was to serve as the official channel of intercourse between the men and the company officials. At the end of the meeting, 100 employees signed a pledge that they would not join any but the company brotherhood, and that neither threats nor intimidation would induce them to strike in the future. 1. Later that same morning, a similar meeting of New York Railways employees was held, at which 120 workers were selected to carry a petition to the mayor informing him that they would join only a company union, and requesting that he afford them protection on their jobs. 2. The truce in practice. All this occurred before the agreement of August 6 had been signed, and no sooner had the signatures been attached than the IRT management intensified its anti-union activities. Shantz and Headley set the pace for the rest of the transit companies. They set out deliberately to confront the committee selected by the amalgamated with one elected under company surveillance. These two committees, it was planned, would then be set to bid against each other, with the company-blessed committee receiving every advantage. As the Shantz-Headley plan frankly stated, "We recognize no union. We will make conditions so fair and attractive that no man will feel it necessary to go outside the company to attempt to make things different." 3 LNTER Borough set aside 2 days, August 17 and 18, for elections for members of the company union committee. At company-sponsored meetings, Headley bluntly told the workers that men who joined a company union rather than the amalgamated would be especially rewarded. Point 4. The Shantz-Headley plan was actually nothing more than a replica of the company union established on the Philadelphia Rapid Transit after the bitter strike in 1910. Its mentor was T. E. Midden, vice president and general manager, who put it across with the aid of Berghoff undercover men. Midden's brainchild became known as the Keystone Carmen's Union, and it gave birth to an offspring in 1912 on the Milwaukee surface lines. 6 years later, another one was born on the New York transit lines. Despite union protests, management announced that company unions would be established, insisting that the adjustment of grievances is better left to the employee's own organization without the interposition of any outside body. At meetings with officials of the amalgamated, management representatives refused to rehire the men who had been fired for activity during the strike, despite the agreement to refrain from such action. They also refused to desist from establishing a company union. Point 5. On August 15, a committee representing employees of the New York Railways, the IRT subsidiary, addressed a letter to President Shantz, pointing to what we consider a deliberate and flagrant violation of this agreement, entered into between yourself and representatives of the employees, upon the part of the officials of your company. Specific violations were listed. 1. Indiscriminate discharging of men. 2. Interference by the company with the selection of the committees to represent the employees. The committee therefore asked for an immediate conference to settle these differences. Point 6. For a discussion of the 1910 strike, which was also a general strike in Philadelphia, and the origin of the company union, see Philip S. Foner, History of the Labor Movement in the United States, Volume 5, New York, 1980, pp. 143-63. The New York Call saw the John D. Rockefeller Company Union in Colorado as Shantz model, pointing out that this was not surprising in view of the fact that Rockefeller Ivy Lee is one of his chief advisors, August 16, 1916. When nothing came of this complaint, Fitzgerald sent a formal protest to Mayor Mitchell charging management with deliberate and flagrant violation of the agreement on the same 2 counts. Since Mitchell, a leading promoter of preparedness, was at the Plattsburgh training camp, nothing could be done. But when the mayor returned to New York City and met with management and union representatives, the former refused to budge, and insisted on its right to advise its employees that they could join a company union. To the union's chagrin, Mayor Mitchell refused to restrict the company's activities on behalf of a company union. He argued that as long as the employers did not hold out specific financial inducements, you cannot properly object to the company arguing with the men to join the union. Let us have it clearly understood that both sides have a right to argue, persuade and induce. 7. As Melvin Dubofsky correctly notes, given management's financial resources, its high-powered attorneys, and its nearly unchallenged right to hire and fire, the mayor's neutrality offered the New York Railways Company free rein to continue its labor-baiting policies. 8. So much for the amalgamated's faith in Mayor Mitchell. On August 30, a conference took place between the IRT management and a 2-3-man negotiating committee representing union men on the IRT subway and elevated lines. The union committee brought with them a list of 24 demands aimed at rectifying the Carmen's major grievances: hours, wages, and working conditions. Its wage demands were backed up with a scale of wages paid on transit lines in 42 major cities in the nation, which showed that New York City's scale was the lowest. While the amalgamated's list of demands did not include a day off for motormen or conductors, it did call for a 10-hour working day to be concluded within 12 consecutive hours, overtime to be paid at the rate of time and a half. That night work was to be concluded within a 12-hour period, but not to be extended beyond 7 a.m. Other demands called for a statement of charges to be handed a man accused of misconduct, that a hearing should include a union representative, that a man should not lose pay for having to answer petty charges, that a man found innocent of alleged violations or charges was to lose no pay, that a man was not to be docked for failing to obtain the names of witnesses, that a motorman's hourly rate was to be paid regardless of what duties he was assigned to, that uniforms were to be purchased in the open market, but conform to the company's specifications of color and style, that a motorman be paid a .35 hourly bonus for instructing, and a .50 hourly bonus for snowplowing, sweeping or scraping, with an extra man on such a run. Finally, provisions were made for union representatives to carry out their functions in behalf of the employees without loss of position or seniority rights. 9. These demands reveal how utterly exploited were the workers on the New York transit lines, yet management's representatives completely ignored the union's demands. Instead, they presented an individual working agreement or labor contract, which was being circulated among IRT employees. The contract, labeled by the union a master-servant agreement or yellow dog contract, forbade the signer from joining any labor organization not recognized by the employer. All workers who signed the individual contract were promised immediate wage increases as their reward for forswearing union organization. A mass meeting of IRT men was called the following night. When a union spokesperson told some 3,000 men what the contract actually meant, they unanimously empowered organizer Fitzgerald to call a strike if the contracts were not withdrawn from circulation. 2. At a September 5 conference with the IRT local union committee, management rejected the committee's request that the company submit to arbitration the fairness or unfairness of the individual contract. William Fitzgerald replied for the union, "I don't see how we can avoid a strike on the Interborough Rapid Transit Company's lines subways, elevated, and streetcars." 12. Actually, the company was anticipating this response and began making plans for another strike. 3,000 strikebreakers were sent to terminal points on subway and elevated lines. Management then posted a notice informing employees who participated in the strike that they would lose benefits of the agreement and all cumulative seniority. Letters were also sent to Mayor Mitchell requesting lice protection, and another to Governor Whitman requesting the militia to supplement the police force. 13. The IRT management was not only ready for the strike, but welcomed it. There was no shortage of strikebreakers since the threatened National Railroad walkout had been headed off by the Adamson Act. Interborough was in the position to make use of more than 6,000 of these unused professionals, gangsters and thugs who had been collected in and around New York by Berghoff and other strikebreaking agencies. The strike that Interborough wanted, management was convinced, was bound to lead to the destruction of the union. 14. Basically, the IRT was setting the pattern for the other transit companies. On his return from Europe, Whitridge took over wage negotiations for the Third Avenue system. He claimed the road could not afford to meet the union's demands, unless the city came to its rescue and absorbed some of its costs. But that did not prevent the board of C below pp. 176-83 directors from declaring its regular quarterly 10% dividend. Third Avenue then joined LNTER Borough in discharging strikers and forcing its employees into a company union, TS. The second transit strike begins. At 9:20 p.m., September 6, 1916, at a mass meeting at the Lyceum, the members of Division 731, Amalgamated Street and Electric Railway employees, voted unanimously to declare a strike on the IRT subway, elevated, and streetcar lines. The strike vote came in response to the report of a committee which had met with General Manager Headley, at which the IRT manager had absolutely refused to cancel the master and servant individual agreements. 16. When the news of the strike vote was reported to IRT President Shantz, he seemed to be pleased. "All agreements are off," he told reporters. "This is a fight to the finish and we are 100% prepared." IRT attorney James L. Quackenbush added that, "If there are enough bluecoats and brass buttons and nightsticks, not revolvers, where they are needed, the strike won't last long." 17. By the morning of September 7, the second part of the New York City transit strike was on. Although the IRT management offered double pay and 20% bonus to all workers who refused to join the strike, over 25% of the subway and elevated men walked off their jobs, while a majority of the streetcar men began taking their cars to the barns. Conductors rolled up signs, "No passengers." On way to the barn. 18. New Yorkers were handed leaflets distributed by both sides in the labor dispute. In its appeal to the public, the IRT declared, "Let no one be misled by the charge that the Interborough is trying to crush out unionism. We are not fighting unionism. The fact was," the statement continued, "the company actually encouraged the formation of a union among LNTER borough workers." Nothing, of course, was said about the union being a company union, but a hint at this was contained in the comment that the IRT believed that the interests of this company, its employees and the public they serve will be fostered if all relations between the company and its employees were conducted in the light of their common interests, rather than with reference to the interest of outside parties. Then what was the cause of the present strike? It all boiled down to one simple fact. The real point underlying the existing difficulties is the determination of the amalgamated union to impose itself upon the company, and to supplant the union of the Interborough employees against the expressed will of the men themselves. As for the company, all it was doing was protecting its employees in their right to work and the public in its right to ride as against the efforts of the amalgamated association to prevent the doing of these two things. 19. Since many of the men operating the streetcars, subway, and elevated lines were nearly all professional strikebreakers, who were only able to operate because Mayor Mitchell had placed policemen on every car to protect the scabs, it was certainly stretching the truth considerably to talk of protecting the employees of the IRT. The leaflet distributed by the amalgamated was entitled, "Why There is a Strike on the New York Car Lines." It went in part. Shantz and Headley want to break the union. They want to control the wages and EVAs of the men and their families, just as they have done. The men want to be free. They are taxed from 75 cents to $1 a month for Mr. Shantz and Mr. Headley's benevolent society. They would rather pay that sum to a union of their own. They don't want to pay that much to the company's union to be further controlled and subjugated. They don't get anything back if they leave the company, and they lose the sick benefits they paid for. In their own union they retain this benefit if they resign or leave. Shantz and Headley are only tools. They must enforce the will of the masters. Rockefeller and Morgan want the men subjugated. They want unionism destroyed. They want to control their employees like chattel. The men are not striking for higher pay or shorter hours. These questions they agreed to arbitrate. They are striking because Shantz and Headley want to destroy the unions which compelled them to grant the slight increases. They deliberately violated their solemn pact and discharged men who would not quit the union and sign the company's individual agreement. 20. By September 10 the strike on the IRT had spread to the New York Railways Company and the Third Avenue Transit Company. Despite their existing contracts, the workers on both of these lines struck in sympathy with their fellow workers on the IRT. Moreover, these men understood that if the individual employment agreements prevailed on the IRT, it would only be a short time before they would be the only form of employer-labor relationship on all of the transit lines, and a real union, not a company union, would have no place in New York City's transit industry. So the men on the New York Railways and Third Avenue lines were striking for themselves as well as for their brothers on the IRT. But the commercial press used the fact that the existing contracts had been broken as a weapon for attacking the transit workers. 21. As in the first strike, only one paper stood behind the strikers, the Socialist New York Call. This time, moreover, there were two Callisto do the work. On the first day of the second strike, the Call announced that there would be a new paper on the streets this afternoon. It will be the Evening Call. There is a need for an evening paper supporting the Carmen's Union, the Call explained. There is need for continuous news. The Evening Call will be published as long as the strike requires it. Then it will stop. It will be an emergency paper. The regular editorial staff of the Call has volunteered to work the double trick necessary to handle both papers. 22. Local New York of the Socialist Party helped distribute the Call to the riding public. Moreover, the Socialist Party resolved to extend to the striking street railway workers the unrestricted use of our halls, speakers and press, and our sapon in every way possible, and we hereby call upon our members and sympathizers to assist these strikers in whichever way they can, and especially to refrain from riding on cars or trains run by strikebreakers. 23. Responding to this appeal, Socialist Party members helped the striking carmen in a wide variety of ways. On Sash Day, 5,000 Socialist Union young women did picket duty for the striking transit workers wearing the "Don't Be a Scab" sashes. Before the strike was a week old, these sashes were already famous in New York City. 24. PSC reports. The strike was only 11 hours old when the Public Service Commission intervened, and Chairman Oscar Strauss subpoenaed officials of the union and the IRT for a hearing. After 6 days of hearings, the Commission issued a report which was, on the whole, favorable to the union. It found that the IRT was bound by the August 6 agreement to arbitrate its differences with the union, and it concluded that while the agreement had been violated, it had not been destroyed by the actions of the parties, and that the moral obligation to maintain it still continues. The Commission made 4 recommendations. 1. That the question whether the distribution of the individual contracts constituted a violation of the agreements be referred to arbitration in the manner provided in the agreement. 2. That the charge that the company sought to secure acceptance of the individual contracts by fraud, misrepresentation, coercion, or intimidation be referred in the same way. 3. That the parties proceed with the conferences where they left off, and that, in order that friction be avoided, they agree upon some impartial person to preside, or if they cannot agree, that they permit the mayor and the chairman of the commission to name such impartial person, to have no authority to decide, but merely to preserve the parties from further misunderstandings and disagreements, and, further, that such conferences be held in public. 4. That the strike should be declared off immediately, is Shantz immediately turned down the PSC's request that the company arbitrate differences with the union on the ground that he owed allegiance to his loyal employees. He insisted that the PSC had capitulated to the amalgamated, and he would not let outsiders come between us and our employees. Moreover, any further conferences with the amalgamated would only demoralize the discipline of the service with resultant injury to the public. 26. While the union accepted the Commission's report and agreed to comply with all of its recommendations, provided all employees were returned to their status as of August 29, it rejected the PSC's conclusion that the issue of trade unionism was not involved in the dispute. On the contrary, this was the major issue, and the very fact that the company refused to accede to the Commission's recommendations proved it. 27. A second PSC report dealing with the 3rd Avenue line strike was totally hostile to the union. While the report did concede that the company had acted in a way that provoked the workers, this could not justify their action in striking, especially since the men went on strike after Mayor Mitchell and Chairman Strauss had made it clear that such action would constitute a breach of contract. 28. The net result of the Commission's reports was to strengthen the transit company's standing in the community. For the commercial press played down the first report criticizing the IRT, and played up the criticism of the union and the carmen for striking the 3rd Avenue line, thereby violating their contract. Since the IRT paid no attention to the PSC recommendations and the Commission did nothing but recommend arbitration, it meant that the strike would be left to work itself out. Meanwhile, the companies received full support from the city as they brought in more strikebreakers who received full police protection at taxpayers' expense. In a bid for public sympathy, the amalgamated sponsored a huge parade of strikers on September 14. K was a march without music, a silent parade. Starting at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, thousands of striking employees of the LNTER Borough, the New York Railways Company, the Westchester Companies, and the 3rd Avenue Railroad Company marched from 86th Street to Union Square, where a mass meeting was held. The marchers went 4 abreast carrying banners with such slogans as, "Real men need no cages, Shantz says the public pays." Of course. Look over the parade and note the aliens. This is a strike for the right to live like men. Watch your step when you ride in scab cars. The PSC says we are right. An old-timer with 50 years of service carried the banner. Do you want men or monkeys to run your cars? This reference to monkeys was dire. Ted at the Sarek breaking motormen, whose cars had wire screening placed in front of the windows to protect them from stones, hurled by strikers and sympathizers. Telegrams of support were read to the gathering in Union Square, and Fitzgerald in his remarks told the cheering crowd that 400,000 Unionists in New York City were ready to quit in support of the transit strikers. New York State Federation of Labor President James P. Holland endorsed Fitzgerald's remark. "When you fellows need help," he declared, "remember there are 500,000 organized men in this city ready to lay down their tools to help you win your fight for organization." 29. Threats of general strike, was the New York Times heading over the report of the speeches by Fitzgerald and Holland. 30. Preparations for a general strike. According to figures released by the police department, subway and elevated traffic were cut about 45% by the 4th day of the strike. 31. Even though it was assumed that this was a conservative estimate, it was clear that it would not be easy to increase the drop in traffic from this point on. With the tremendous assistance the police force was giving the companies by protecting the strikebreakers, with the steady attacks on the union and its members in the commercial press, with Mayor Mitchell openly siding with the transit companies, and the PSC washing its hands of the dispute after its initial recommendations, there appeared to be no force capable of helping the strikers except organized labor. From the outset, the union's leadership sensed that they were in for a long struggle, and that it was bound to be a losing one unless the strikers were able to arouse the rest of the labor movement to the. Dubofsky argues that prior to the violation of the contracts by the strikers of the New York Railways Company and the 3rd Avenue line, the strikers enjoyed wide support in the commercial press, that is, apart from the New York Times. But this exaggerates the few gestures on the part of the New York commercial papers criticizing the corporation managers. See Dubofsky, Op. Cit. Page. 140. The New York Call found it necessary to issue a special evening edition to present the strikers' side of events even before the workers on the New York Railways Company and the 3rd Avenue line joined the walkout. Threat posed by the individual working agreement, the transit companies, Yellow Dog contract, and the company union movement on the transit lines. In fact, the striking carmen appeared to have believed at the outset of the walkout that if they found themselves unable to halt the wholesale importation of strikebreakers and the unlimited police protection for scabs, the AFL would come to their aid with a general sympathetic strike of all the trades under its control. They had been assured by AFL emissaries who practically promised a general strike if the carmen found themselves losing, and that the full resources of the national organization were to be ranged on their side in case of need. The New York Times so reported after a survey of attitudes among the strikers. 32. In any event, on the 2nd day of the strike, amalgamated officials met with leaders of the Central Federated Union, which represented some 500,000 trade unionists in New York City. The entire meeting was devoted to methods of aiding the carmen. One proposal which produced much applause was advanced by John J. Riley of the Longshoremen's Union. He declared that his union had discussed a plan of boycotting the Traction Trust by refusing to load coal consigned to the powerhouses. As a further means of hitting the Morgan interests, which, Riley declared, controlled the transportation system of New York, the union proposed that the men refuse also to load ammunition and supplies consigned to the Allies. That will hit them in two places. We are 35,000 strong and the Central Federated Union has but to say the word for us to take immediate action. At this meeting, however, all that was done was the option of a resolution calling upon AFL President Samuel Gompers to come to the city to assume supreme command of the biggest strike any city has ever experienced. 33 Shantz, however, immediately sensed that the resolution contained the seeds of a general strike, and he issued a public statement expressing doubt that Gompers, a wise man, would order a city-wide strike, or that he would attempt such a strategy, since there is also a question of just how much the people of the city will stand. Moreover, he wanted Gompers to understand that the transit companies were not fighting organized labor, but only a branch of it, a most irresponsible branch. Moreover, point 34. Gompers came to New York the following day, and urged all unions to render moral and financial support to the amalgamated. He labeled the action of the IRT management a lockout, and charged that the companies were trying to crush out the spirit of organization. To this, Shantz made the fantastic reply that actually the company not only favored unions but encouraged the formation of one company union. Moreover, the company went one step further. It not only agreed to a contract with the men collectively, but it asked that the agreement also be submitted to each man individually. 35. What could be more American than a company union and a yellow dog contract? Of course, to workers all this was only giving fancy names for a new method of driving out unions. 36. Sentiment for a general strike accelerated after the publication on September 17 of a report to the Committee on Industrial Relations on the transit strike in New York City. The report emphasized that the carmen of New York were waging the greatest fight for trade unionism and industrial freedom of the era, and waging it, moreover, against the Morgan and associated financial interests, which were determined to wipe out unionism throughout the land. The report continued, "From Wall Street has gone forth the order that trades unionism in the city of New York and in the nation must be destroyed. The evidence are multiplying that all the forces in the banking headquarters of New York have drawn together, or are drawing together, in an industrial war on the workers who are seeking to use the opportunities of prosperity to free themselves from industrial servitude. The challenge was thrown down to labor here by the LNTER Borough and the Morgan interests as a climax to the declaration of war on organized labor in California, to the increasing efforts of the Steel Trust to beat down the organization of the workers in the Pittsburgh District, in Youngstown and on the Minnesota-Mesabi Range. It came in response to the efforts of the National Association of Manufacturers to break up trades unionism, and finally, it was thrown down in the desperate resistance to the great victory for the 8-hour day won by the four railroad brotherhoods. ***** 37. After many statements by union leaders, company officials, and city and state government leaders, a number of them contradictory, the Central Federated Union adopted a resolution calling for a general strike on September 22. Since most of the unions planning to join in sympathy with the strikers were working under collective agreements, each of them began issuing statements that if they struck it would be for their own demands, but if their actions would result in aid for the carmen, they would not be sorry. 38. In an effort to avoid implementation of the CFU resolution, Mayor Mitchell called the amalgamated and IRT officials to a conference in his office. Shantz consented to meet with Mitchell, but refused to sit with the references to the Mooney case in San Francisco. See above, pp. 25-40 and Foner, History of Lilbour Movement 4, 420-26. See pp. 184-88. Officials of the amalgamated, and also made it crystal clear that under no circumstances would management deal with the union. 39. Instead of condemning management for its refusal to budge from its intransigent position even if necessary to prevent a general strike, Mayor Mitchell read the union leaders a stern lecture. Conditions which you yourselves have indicated might follow general sympathetic strikes would be grossly violating of the laws, and would convulse the civilized and orderly life of this community. We wish to make it unmistakably clear to you that to prevent that condition the full civil and military powers conferred by law upon the mayor will be employed. We trust that the sober second thought and better judgment of the men who direct the course and policies of organized labor in this city will lead them to refrain from declaring sympathetic strikes. 40. Mitchell did more than lecture. He threatened to call out the militia. Meanwhile, every available member of the police force was put on strike duty, and Chief Inspector Schmidberger told the transit officials that they might establish night service as soon as they were ready, since the police department was ready to meet any emergency. In other words, the companies were given assurance that the entire police force would be at their service night and day. If there had been any inclination on management's part to negotiate and arbitrate, this ended that. Schmidberger proved he meant what he said by establishing 50 auto patrols and assigning 100 motorcycle police to tour the city to report where reinforcements should be sent. District Attorney Swan, for his part, stated that he would prosecute those guilty of disorder under the most drastic laws available. By this he did not mean disorder on the part of the gangster element strikebreakers, but only on the part of strikers. 41. In addition to these police measures, Mayor Mitchell issued a statement blaming the union for the strike and, in another statement, with PSC Chairman Strauss, he declared once again that the issue of trade unionism was not involved in the dispute between the amalgamated and the transit companies, only the integrity of certain contracts entered into. 42. In response, Secretary Ernest Boehm of the Central Federated Union issued a statement on behalf of Gompers which read, "Trade unionists will not surrender their right to organize in this city, and every possible help that the AFL can give will be extended to the amalgamated to maintain this right. This is a fight on the issue of trade unionism, and were the traction companies to win, other employers would resort to the plan of making master and servant contracts. 43. The general strike fiasco. No trade union in New York City walked out on September 22. Instead, late that afternoon, the Greater New York Labor Conference, consisting of 90 union leaders representing the Central Federated Union, the Central Labor Union of Brooklyn, the United Hebrew Trades, and the Building Trades Council, issued a call for a general suspension of work on September 2. 7. Instead of a general strike, the argument went, a general suspension of work would not entail a breach of existing contracts. Such a suspension of work was necessary. New York City workers had no choice but to cease working since no adequate facilities are afforded them. Union men feel that they cannot be true to the cause of organized labor and still maintain their self-respect as union men if they ride in scab cars. No other means of conveyance is available, so they must stay home. 44. In a statement to the press, the union leaders charged that the blame for the work stoppage would fall on the city authorities. The elected government of this city had stepped aside and given way to a government composed of 5 men. These 5 men are Theodore P. Shantz, Frank Headley, James Whitridge, James Quackenbush and Leo C. Burgo FF. The wish of these men today is the law of New York City. The police force of the city is at their command. The mayor, his cabinet and a majority of the board of aldermen have ceased to operate to all intents and purposes. At least 50 strikers were arrested each day and given heavy sentences on charges of disorderly conduct. Such a condition is almost without parallel. Such a complete abdication of power by the lawfully elected government is unheard of. We call upon the entire city to demand that the elected government be restored to power and this 5-man money government of despotism be ousted forever. 5. Hugh Frayne, AFL representative in New York, expressed confidence that the morning of the 27th would see 240,000 striking workers on the avenues of New York. Even this, said the New York Call, was an underestimation, and it predicted 800,000 marching, elbow to elbow. You can feel the thrill go down the Great Line. You can see spring come into the step of men and women. You can see eyes alight, heads up. You can sec the inspiration of it in the faces of men and women. 46. The Socialist Party set up a special strike committee to give the general strike all the support the movement could muster, and it made it obligatory upon all socialist members of unions to go out with their unions. 47. On the 27th the general strike began. If one were to judge from a resolution adopted by a committee of the Labor Convention, the response was overwhelming. The resolution hailed with joy the courageous action of the vast number of workers of the various trades and industries in this city who have this morning laid down their tools and opened the general movement of New York's labor army by calling the suspension of work in sympathetic support of their brothers now on strike against the streetcar companies. 48. In reality, whether called a general strike or a work suspension, the response was a fiasco. The Joint Labor Committee supervising the general strike released figures to the press citing 173,000 men and women who were said to have joined the transit strikers. But in actuality only 6 local unions officially called out their membership in support of the carmen. These included brewery workers, 6,000, paperhangers, 1,000, machinists, 4,000, eccentric firemen, 800, painters local 435, 250, Italian painters local, 450, a total of 12,500 workers. 49. On Thursday, September 2, 8, the Building Trades Council of Greater New York, comprising some 150,000 men, decided to postpone action for a week. The Teamsters followed suit and other unions decided to emulate the example of the building trades and defer participation in the general strike. Since Thursday and Friday, September 28 and 29, were Jewish holidays, the 200,000 Jewish trade unionists remained out, but they were not on strike, and returned to work on Monday. Local L0, the ILGWU Garment Cutters was enjoined by injunction from violating its contract by supporting the strike and capitulated. All the printing trades unions voted to abide by their contracts and remain at work. The United Hebrew Trades did not answer the strike call, even though its counsel, Morris Hillquit, had voted support of the general strike. Neither did the Tidewater Boatmen nor the International Longshoremen's Association, whose membership had actually authorized the strike.so. On October 1st, the brewery workers, convinced that they had put themselves out on the limb, returned to work. The following day the Joint Labor Committee acknowledged total failure. Organized labor, the committee lamely explained, did want to help the streetcarmen provided a definite plan had been decided and agreed upon. 51 Only the New York Call refused to face the facts. Why did the general strike movement fail? It asked editorially, and it answered. The committee was composed of Peter J. O'Brien, Chairman, Morris Hillquit, Secretary, and Melinda Scott, William Holder, Louis Fritiger, James H. Vahey, Hugh Frayne, Ernest Boehm, and William H. Fitzgerald. New York Call, September 28, 1916. In the first place, it didn't fail. With serious, purposeful people there is no such thing as fail. Labor doesn't know failure. The men and women who create the world's wealth cannot fail and they do not fail. The general strike didn't win what it set out to win. But that doesn't mean failure. It simply means that it needed rehearsing before it went into that kind of battle. 52. The official organ of the Capmakers Union put it more accurately. It takes more than vulgar bluff to subdue the thugs of corporation capital. 53. The commercial press had a field day gleefully proclaiming the death of the general strike that never was. 0R as the New York American declared. Nothing can die until it has first been alive. And the general strike was not even born. Another paper, more severe, termed the ludicrous bluff of calling the suspension of work by Jewish mechanics and operators during their religious holidays a sympathetic strike. The last straw which made the whole thing a farce. 54. Why the general strike failed. 5 months after the general strike fiasco, a controversy emerged which threw light on the reasons for the failure of the sympathetic strike to get off the ground. Writing in the January 1917 issue of the Typographical Journal, official organ of the International Typographical Union, President Margden G. Scott of the ITU pointed out, New York Typographical Union did not vote for a sympathetic strike, and no such infamous proposition was ever given serious consideration. The strike order issued over the signature of the Central Federated Union received scant consideration when presented to our subordinate organizations in New York City. Some of them laid the communication on the table. Others put it under the table. The same treatment, Scott discovered on investigation, was accorded the strike order in other unions. The reason, he also discovered, was that to have complied with the order for a sympathetic strike would have meant destroying our contracts in New York City, and no responsible labor leader would listen to the invitation to break existing contracts. In short, the transit strikers had been sold a bill of goods which no labor leader was willing to deliver. Scott then launched into a bitter attack on Samuel Gompers, accusing the AFL president of having failed to meet the emergency which arose in New York City in September, and even encouraging the forces promoting a general strike, forces which threatened to destroy labor contracts regardless of the obligations included in them. SS. Gompers' reply, published in the New York Times, reveals further why the general strike never took place. Contrary to what Scott had stated, Gompers claimed he not only had not encouraged the general strike, but had come to New York City for the precise purpose of preventing a sympathetic strike of the working people, in sympathy with the striking street railway men. I declared that I would have nothing to do with it and repudiated the Emeyer situation, and declared that it was violative of the fundamental principles of trade unionism and the laws of the American Federation of Labor. While Gompers did not claim that his stand had resulted in preventing the general strike being inaugurated, he asked Scott to draw your own inference. One thing is sure, the general strike did not occur. 56. At its January 1917 meeting, the Central Federated Union of New York City supported Gompers in his dispute with Scott and credited the AFL president with having influenced the trade unions of the city to reject the call to join in a general strike in support of the striking transit workers. 57. It is significant that Gompers did not mention the fact that he had sent a telegram to the Union Square mass meeting of the transit strikers following the Silent March on September 14, in which he promised them that anything and everything within my power will be freely given to bring about an honorable and advantageous outcome of the heroic defensive struggle now being waged against the heartless traction tyrants, who have no conception of their responsibilities to their oppressed employees or to the public. 58. Nor did Gompers mention the fact that, as we have seen, he had authorized Ernest Boehm of the Central Federated Union to assure New Yorkers that trade unionists would not surrender their right to organize in their city, and that every possible help that the AFL can give will be extended to the amalgamated to maintain this right. In short, Gompers was playing a double game. On the one hand, he was raising the hopes of the transit strikers that the AFL would go all out, even to the point of a general strike, to maintain their right to organize a real union, while he was secretly undermining the movement for a sympathetic strike. It did not seem to matter to Gompers, or for that matter to the other AFL leaders, that the failure to carry through on the promise of a sympathetic strike, after raising the hopes of the transit strikers, broke the back of their struggle. End of the transit strike. The strike of the transit workers continued, but with declining vigor, all through the fall of 1916, with men, assisted by their wives, daughters, and even mothers, fighting stubbornly. On October 6, the fiery veteran of many labor struggles in the coalfields, Mother Jones, led a group of strikers' wives in a mass demonstration. 59 Gradually, however, with the aid of strikebreakers under police protection, the companies raised the degree of service. Double pay was banned on the lines, though a 20% bonus was continued for the month of October. By the third month of the strike, policemen were taken off the trains except for one each on the station platforms and on surface line trolleys. Despite the continuing number of serious accidents and collisions, due to inexperienced motormen, the companies were permitted to operate their lines with strikebreakers, while the discouraged strikers drifted back on condition that they resign from the amalgamated and sign oaths guaranteeing to belong only to the company unions. 60. Christmas of 1916 still found men holding out, but it was clear that the battle was lost. Even then, in the 15th week of the strike, over 1,000 remaining stalwarts among the strikers met and voted unanimously to continue the strike. At this time, the Amalgamated released its first comprehensive figures on the second half of the strike. It RTED that of the 331 men who had answered the second strike call, only 717 deserted and returned to the struck transit lines. Of the remaining 9,614, approximately 1,600 were still out of work, approximately an equal number left the city to find work elsewhere, while the remainder had already found work in other fields of employment. 61. Though this report was an admission that serious organized resistance to the transit companies was at an end, the Amalgamated actually never called off the strike. At its 1917 convention, 11 months later, the union did not list a date of termination for the New York transit strike of 1916.62. Aftermath. There were endless discussions in the labor, socialist, and liberal press over the reasons for the failure of the transit strill. Liberal journals generally placed the blame on the Amalgamated and its supporters for having alienated public opinion by arrogant disregard of existing contracts and pushing for a general strike. Labor and socialist papers placed asterisk in his analysis of the causes for the defeat of the strike. Dubofsky puts his entire emphasis upon this theme. See Dubofsky, Op. Cit. pp. 141-43. The blame on the free and unlimited use of strikebreakers and the open assistance given the corporations by the city and state administrations. Certainly the fact that, as it was disclosed after the strike, the transit companies had spent $3,500,000 for scabs and other thugs to break the strike, lent strength to this argument. But as James Connolly, the Irish patriot and labor leader, explained, it was not the scabs, however, who turned the scale against the strikers in favor of the masters. That service to transit capital was performed by good union men with union cards in their pockets. These men were the engineers in the powerhouses which supplied the electric power to run the cars, and without whom all the scabs combined could not have run a single trip. They were unconsciously being compelled by their false system of organization, craft unions, to betray their struggling brothers. 63. The same point was made early in the strike by the Weekly People, official organ of the Socialist Labor Party. We see certain trains upon the elevated lines and subway running. Why are they running? Why are not the firemen and powerhouse men called out? The Stationary Firemen's Union, an AFL organization, whose chief is Timothy Healy, has let its men remain on the job aiding the company to run the trains. What is such an act but an act of scabbing, of treason, to the men on strike? 64. The narrow AFL craft form of organization, embodied in the transit unions, led inevitably to the Union Scab, and the Union Scab became a powerful weapon of the corporations in defeating the 1916 strike. In an analysis of the declining power of the strike movement, Reverend Bouck White of the Church of Social Revolution noted that organization along craft lines rendered the transit unions unable to grapple with the Wall Street-dominated, highly financed traction corporations. He charged, too, that the failure of the AFL unions to respond to the general strike was a symptom of their narrow craft outlook. 65. A major cause for the defeat of the transit strike was the Amalgamated's reliance upon arbitration and its faith in the progressive outlook of Mayor Mitchell. The union hailed the August 6 truce agreement as an unprecedented victory, even though it was clear to most observers that it left the companies in a position to destroy the union piecemeal. Fitzgerald conceded the fundamental weakness of the union's approach when he told a public gathering on September 17 that the second strike was called to preserve the victory won in the first walkout. 66. A queer victory indeed. In the second mic, Mayor Mitchell showed his true colors, but signs of this were already present during the first walkout. In the second strike, the powerful traction companies were well prepared to crush the union, and only a united power of organized labor could withstand the power of monopoly capital, aided by the city and state governments. But that united power of labor was never forthcoming. The New York transit workers certainly demonstrated that they did not lack fighting spirit. But fighting spirit was not enough, and they paid a terrible price for the narrow outlook of the union with which they were associated. The defeat of the 1916 strike tied the transit workers to company unionism and miserable working conditions. As late as 1934, 35,000 transit workers in New York City were still compulsory members of company unions. In order to obtain a job with any of the transit companies, the IRT, BMT, 3rd Avenue Line, Yonkers Railroad, 5th Avenue Coach and New York City Omnibus Corporation, as well as the other smaller lines, a worker had to join the company union. In May 1934, 2,000 leaflets were distributed to the New York transit workers announcing the formation of the Transport Workers Union. Independent. It was an industrial union, and it marked the opening of a new and decisive stage in the history of unionism among the transit workers. 67.